Before we begin, we must state that this entire narrative is a compilation of information gathered from decades of court documents, federal indictments, declassified FBI files, newspaper archives, and published accounts by crime historians and journalists. The purpose of this presentation is solely to bring to you, the audience, a structured and factual account of one of the most enigmatic criminal figures of the 20th century. This story involves violent crimes, and its intention is not to glorify but to document and inform. The truth is often more shocking than fiction, and the story of the man who truly ruled the Chicago outfit from the shadows is perhaps the most shocking of them all. If you are ready to hear the real story, listen closely. The most dangerous man in Chicago was a ghost, a specter that haunted the city's underworld and the hallowed halls of its legitimate power structures for over half a century, his influence seeping into the very fabric of the metropolis like a slow, undetectable poison. While the headlines screamed about Al Capone's brutal public massacres and the flamboyant, self-destructive trials of modern gangsters, the true, enduring power resided with a man who was a master of absence, a virtuoso of the void, a figure who possessed no fingerprints on file with the Federal Bureau of Investigation for most of his adult life, a man who, astoundingly, never spent a single night in prison after the age of 40 despite being the suspected architect of countless crimes, a man who spoke so softly, so infrequently, that you had to lean in to catch the whisper of his words, and a man whose face was forever marked by a single, brutal act of youthful violence that became his legendary, terrifying moniker, a permanent brand that spoke of a past he could never escape and a ferocity he never needed to prove again. This is not the story of a loud, chest-thumping kingpin craving recognition. This is the story of a corporate-style CEO of crime, a strategic, calculating genius whose profound silence built a multi-million-dollar empire and whose meticulous, almost pathological caution ensured it would survive and thrive long after he was gone from this earth. His name was John DiFronzo, a name that would mean nothing to the average citizen on the streets of Chicago, but to the world of organized crime, he was known by a more visceral, more sinister name, a name that evoked both his violent origins and his terrifying, unassailable reputation, No-Nose. To understand how this quiet, unassuming man became the invisible, omnipotent hand guiding one of America's most feared and resilient criminal organizations, we must travel back to the very beginning, to the rough-and-tumble, cobblestone streets of Chicago's near West Side, a vibrant, crowded, and often desperate little Italy, where a young boy's future was being irrevocably shaped by the potent, inescapable forces of immigrant poverty, raw ambition, and the undeniable, siren song lure of the street, a world where the outfit was not just a criminal syndicate, it was the neighborhood's shadow government, its most reliable source of employment, its ruthless arbiter of disputes, and for a select, ambitious few, the only visible path to a twisted, violent, but undeniably potent version of the American dream, a dream that was systematically denied to them through any legitimate means. It was in this crucible of hope and hardship that John DiFronzo learned his first and most important lesson. Power does not come from being seen and feared by the many, but from being obeyed by the few who matter, and true survival depends on leaving no trace of your passage, a philosophy he would elevate to an art form, making him more myth than man, more rumor than reality, and in doing so, becoming the most successful and elusive boss the Chicago outfit had ever known. The streets were his classroom, and the curriculum was ruthlessness, loyalty, and above all, silence, a silence he would master and weaponize against his enemies, his rivals, and even the full might of the United States government. A silence that would become his greatest asset and his most impenetrable armor, allowing him to operate in plain sight while remaining utterly invisible, a ghost in a city of millions, pulling the strings of a vast criminal enterprise from the quiet solitude of a suburban home, his terrible past etched forever on his face, a warning to those who knew how to read it, and a mystery to everyone else. This is the story of his rise, his reign, and his mysterious downfall, a saga not of loud explosions and public gunfights, but of quiet conversations, unspoken agreements, and the cold, patient application of power, a story that begins not in a boardroom or a throne room, but in the cramped, noisy, and fiercely competitive world of a child fighting for his place in a world that had already predetermined his limits. Limits he was destined to shatter through a combination of sheer will, strategic brilliance, and a capacity for violence that was as efficient as it was terrifying. A story that charts the evolution of a street thief into a master criminal, a man who learned to wear his anonymity as a cloak of invincibility, proving that in the high-stakes game of organized crime, the quietest player in the room is almost always the most dangerous, the one who listens more than he speaks, who observes more than he is seen, and who strikes not with a roar, but with a whisper that echoes with finality. The legend of John No-Nose DiFronzo is the ultimate testament to the power of the shadow over the substance, a chilling reminder that the most formidable empires are often built not on a foundation of fame, but on a bedrock of obscurity, and his life serves as a dark blueprint for how to wield immense power without ever seeming to hold it. A lesson in criminal efficiency that continues to be studied and feared to this very day. A legacy written not in ink, but in silence, a silence that speaks volumes about the nature of true power in the underworld and beyond. The crucible that forged John DiFronzo was the vibrant, chaotic, and fiercely insular world of Chicago's near West Side, a neighborhood known as the Patch, where the air was thick with the aromas of simmering tomato sauces and freshly baked bread, but whose very soil was steeped in the legacy of criminal enterprises that stretched back generations, creating an environment where a young boy's education was split between the solemn, disciplined halls of the local Catholic school and the far more compelling, practical tutorials offered by the bustling, dangerous streets just outside the schoolyard gates. Here, in this tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone and loyalties were as deeply ingrained as family ties, the shadow of the outfit loomed large, not as a distant, fearsome entity, but as a tangible, everyday presence. The successful, well-dressed men who drove new cars and commanded immediate respect were not doctors or lawyers, but were the soldiers and captains of the organization, local boys made good through a combination of nerve, cunning, and a willingness to do what was necessary, becoming walking, talking advertisements for the benefits of a life outside the law, a seductive spectacle for any young man yearning for a way out of the grinding poverty and limited opportunities that defined immigrant life. It was in these streets that a young John, alongside his older brothers Peter and Joseph, learned the foundational principles of his future trade. The importance of territorial control, the unbreakable code of omerta, the sacred silence that protected the group from the authorities, and the brutal calculus of power, where respect was not politely requested but violently taken, and any slight, no matter how small, had to be answered with overwhelming and decisive force to establish one's place in the neighborhood's intricate hierarchy. The petty crimes of youth, shining shoes, running numbers, acting as a lookout, or stealing from local shops, were not merely acts of delinquency but were the essential apprenticeships, the minor league training grounds where boys were scouted for their nerve, their intelligence, and their ability to remain cool under pressure, with the most promising among them being gradually pulled into the orbit of the made men, the formal members of the outfit, who watched and evaluated, looking for the next generation of talent to carry on their work. For John DiFronzo, this was a more relevant and immediate education than anything found in a textbook. It was a survival course where the stakes were not grades, but one's life and freedom, and he proved to be an exceptionally gifted student, demonstrating a preternatural calmness and a strategic mind that set him apart from his more hot-headed peers, who often sought attention and notoriety, while John understood, even then, that the key to longevity was in the careful, unseen accumulation of influence, not in the loud, public declaration of it. This early period of his life was characterized by a series of escalating initiations, each one designed to test his mettle and his loyalty, moving from minor errands to more serious tasks, each successful completion bringing him closer to the inner circle, building a reputation for reliability and efficiency that would become the cornerstone of his entire criminal career. A reputation built not on empty boasts but on a consistent, demonstrable record of getting things done quietly and effectively, without drama or unnecessary complications. It was during this formative time, in the midst of a street fight or a botched robbery, the exact circumstances lost to the fog of street law and intentional obscurity, that the incident occurred which would forever define his public identity and give him the nickname that would follow him to the grave. He suffered a severe injury to his face, specifically his nose, which was badly damaged and never properly repaired, leaving him with a distinctive, flattened, and misshapen profile that made him instantly recognizable within the underworld and earned him the moniker No-Nose, a label that, while seemingly a mark of shame, he would ultimately weaponize, turning a symbol of a past failure or moment of violence into a badge of honor, a permanent reminder of the price of doing business and the toughness required to not only survive it but to wear its mark without flinching. This physical trademark became an integral part of his intimidating presence. It was a silent, brutal testimony to the life he had chosen, a life where pain was a constant companion and disfigurement was a mere occupational hazard, and it communicated a visceral message to anyone who saw him. This man has endured violence, he has dealt violence, and he is not afraid of more violence. A message that often made verbal threats entirely unnecessary, allowing his quiet, calm demeanor to become even more unsettling because it was juxtaposed against such a visibly damaged and hardened countenance. Thus, by the time he was a young man, John No-Nose DiFronzo was no longer just another street kid. He was a known commodity, a rising star in the outfit's firmament, marked by both his physical scar and his growing reputation for cold competence. A young man who had fully absorbed the core lessons of his environment and was now ready to graduate from the small-time struggles of neighborhood dominance to the major leagues of organized crime, under the tutelage of the most powerful and feared men in Chicago, men who had taken note of the quiet, efficient, and strangely patient young man with the ruined face, seeing in him not just a capable soldier, but the potential for something far, far greater. The transition from a promising neighborhood tough to a formal operative within the vast and intricate machinery of the Chicago outfit required more than just a reputation for violence. It demanded a sponsor, a mentor from the highest echelons of the organization who could vouch for a recruit's character, loyalty, and utility. And for John DiFronzo, this pivotal figure materialized in the formidable form of Felix Milwaukee Phil, Alderisio, a man whose very name evoked a special kind of dread. Even within the hardened circles of the underworld, a known master of violence and a prolific hitman who served as a crucial enforcer for the outfit's top leadership. Being brought under the wing of a man like Alderisio was a double-edged sword. It was a fast track to prominence and high-stakes criminal work, but it also came with an immense and unforgiving expectation of performance and an unshakable association with the most brutal aspects of the syndicate's operations, binding one's fate to a master of the dark arts whose primary function was the systematic elimination of problems through final, permanent means. For the quietly ambitious DiFronzo, this association was the ultimate education in the practical application of power, a gruesome postgraduate course where the curriculum was murder, extortion, and the cold-blooded management of fear, and he proved to be an exceptionally adept pupil, not in the wielding of the weapon itself, though he was certainly capable, but in the meticulous logistics of violence, the planning, the timing, the selection of locations, the arrangement of alibis, and most importantly, the maintenance of the impenetrable silence that followed in the wake of each act. Under Alderisio's terrifying tutelage, DiFronzo was immersed in the outfit's most sensitive and profitable enterprises, graduating from street-level hijackings and burglaries to the sophisticated world of large-scale juice loans, where exorbitant interest was levied on desperate businessmen and gamblers, and the collection of these debts required a psychological acumen that went far beyond simple brute force, demanding an understanding of a victim's breaking point, their assets, and their family connections, a calculated pressure that could be applied with surgical precision to maximize financial yield while minimizing messy, public repercussions. This period of the late 1950s and 1960s was the golden age of the outfit's territorial control, a time when its influence reached from the gambling dens and strip clubs of Rush Street into the very core of the city's political and labor institutions. And as a key soldier in Alderisio's crew, DiFronzo was at the very heart of this empire, learning the complex geography of its power, from which police captains were on the pad to which judges could be influenced, and which union officials were partners in crime, all while carefully building his own network of contacts and obligations, a quiet web of influence that he would one day call upon. It was during this time that he began to cultivate his signature persona, the Ghost, mastering the art of being present for the planning and profitable conclusion of a crime while being conspicuously absent during its messy execution, a strategy that involved the careful use of intermediaries, cutouts, and a disciplined refusal to be drawn into conversations that were not absolutely essential, a practice that made him a frustratingly elusive target for law enforcement, who knew his name and his nickname but often struggled to place him directly at the scene of any major crime, a fact that would become a defining feature of his entire criminal resume. While his brother Peter was more publicly identified with the violent, muscular arm of the operation, John was increasingly the brain, the quiet strategist in the background who understood that the real power lay not in being feared on the street, but in being indispensable to the men in the paneled back rooms of suburban restaurants, the men like the legendary Tony the Big Tuna Cardo and the volatile Sam Mooney Giancana, who were the true architects of the outfit's destiny. His rise through the ranks was therefore not a loud, dramatic ascent marked by public confrontations, but a slow, steady, and deliberate climb, a patient process of making himself increasingly valuable and reliable to the powers that be, of successfully completing every task assigned to him without complaint or failure, and of demonstrating a level of fiscal responsibility in his criminal ventures that impressed the corporation-minded Accardo, who valued smart, profitable, and quiet managers above all else. By the time the turbulent 1960s were drawing to a close, with the Giancana era ending in exile and paranoia and the Accardo era reasserting its calm, business-like dominance, John DiFronzo had successfully navigated the treacherous internal politics of the syndicate, survived the intense scrutiny of federal investigations, and had cemented his position as a made man of immense respect and influence. A captain in his own right who no longer operated solely under the shadow of Milwaukee Phil, but, as a standalone power, a master of his own crew and his own lucrative territories, poised and ready for the next phase of his journey, which would see him evolve from a key lieutenant into one of the primary heirs to the entire criminal kingdom. A position he would assume not through a bloody coup, but through the patient, silent outlasting of every rival and the unwavering trust of the only man whose opinion truly mattered. The ascent of John DiFronzo within the Chicago outfit's rigid hierarchy was a masterclass in strategic patience and the quiet accumulation of indispensable value. A slow-burning fuse that led him ever closer to the very heart of power without ever appearing to be a direct threat to those who currently held it. The 1970s marked a pivotal transformation for the outfit, a decade where the old world, flamboyant gangsterism of the past was increasingly becoming a liability in the face of relentless federal scrutiny and the advent of sophisticated electronic surveillance, necessitating a new breed of leader. One who was not only ruthless but also corporately minded, technologically savvy, and preternaturally discreet. A profile that fit DiFronzo with an almost tailor-made precision. While other high-profile mobsters became entangled in flashy rackets and attracted the glaring spotlight of media and law enforcement attention, DiFronzo deliberately submerged himself deeper into the shadows, focusing his immense energies on the outfit's most lucrative and least visible enterprises. The silent, crushing tyranny of the juice loan operation, which bled dry countless businesses under the guise of helping them, and the deeply entrenched infiltration of labor unions, which provided a seemingly endless river of cash through pension fund looting, extortion, and sweetheart contracts, all while offering a legitimate-looking facade for his activities. His genius lay in his understanding that real, lasting power was not measured in newspaper headlines but in financial statements and in the unshakable loyalty of a small, tightly-knit crew of operatives who were, like him, ghosts in the machine, men who knew how to execute orders with clinical efficiency and absolute silence, leaving no forensic or testimonial evidence in their wake. This low-profile strategy did not make him weak. On the contrary, it made him utterly essential to the outfit's financial health and its very survival, as he became the reliable engine of profit that powered the entire organization, the man who could always be counted on to generate massive revenue without the accompanying drama or heat that plagued other factions. It was during this period that his legend within the underworld truly solidified, not as a loudmouth braggart, but as the quiet man in the room whose simple, softly spoken approval or disapproval could mean the difference between prosperity and oblivion for other criminals. A man whose ruined face was a silent testament to a past he had transcended but whose current calm demeanor was far more terrifying than any outburst of temper. He operated from a series of unassuming storefronts and suburban restaurants, his meetings brief and his conversations laced with a deliberate ambiguity that provided plausible deniability, a practice that frustrated law enforcement to no end, as they watched him, followed him, and listened to him, yet could never quite capture the definitive, prosecutable statement that would link him directly to the crimes they knew he was orchestrating. This era also saw him forge a powerful and fateful alliance with other rising, similarly minded stars in the outfit firmament, most notably Joseph the Clown Lombardo, a cunning and unpredictable street-level boss, and the ferocious Butch Blozzy, a loyal enforcer, forming a new inner circle that would eventually come to dominate the organization's leadership, a coalition built on mutual respect, proven competence, and a shared vision for a more streamlined, covert, and profitable criminal corporation. His personal life was a fortress of privacy, a deliberate bulwark against the prying eyes of the world. He lived not in a garish mansion but in a modest, well-kept home in the suburb of River Grove. He was a devoted family man who shunned the nightlife and flash that had undone so many of his predecessors, and he cultivated an image of a simple, hard-working businessman, an illusion so convincing that many of his neighbors would later express stunned disbelief when learning of his true identity and immense power. This disciplined separation of his violent professional life from his tranquil domestic existence was a key component of his longevity, allowing him to present a benign, almost boring facade to the outside world while he secretly presided over a multi-million-dollar empire of crime, proving that the most effective disguise is often a life of quiet normalcy. By the end of the 1970s, as the old guard began to age and the organization faced unprecedented legal pressures from the newly enacted Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO statute, which threatened to dismantle entire criminal enterprises from the top down, the need for a leader of DiFronzo's particular skill set, cautious, financially brilliant, and forensically aware, became not just an asset, but an absolute necessity for the outfit's survival. positioning him perfectly for the ultimate ascent that was soon to come, a transition of power that would be as quiet and bloodless as the man himself, yet would mark the beginning of his true reign as the Ghost King of Chicago. The culmination of John DiFronzo's decades-long, silent campaign for the pinnacle of power arrived not with a dramatic power struggle or a bloody street war, but with the slow, inexorable fading of the old guard and the cold, pragmatic recognition by the outfit's remaining elders that the future of their empire depended on a leader who was virtually immune to the legal system's increasingly sophisticated weapons. The early 1980s saw the convictions of several high-profile bosses and the natural decline of others, creating a vacuum at the very top that could not be filled by the traditional, high-profile mobster who attracted federal attention like a lightning rod. The era of the flamboyant Don was over, and the age of the corporate shadowman had begun, an era tailor-made for the unique talents of no-nos. His ascent to the role of street boss and, later, the de facto head of the entire Chicago outfit, was a seamless, almost organic transition, a quiet consensus among the powerful ruling commission that he was simply the only logical choice, the only man with the operational intelligence, the financial acumen, the unwavering loyalty to the organization's principles, and, most critically, the proven ability to operate for decades without a single major conviction, a record that made him the ultimate asset in a time of legal siege. His reign, which solidified throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, was fundamentally different from any that had come before it. There were no press conferences, no ostentatious displays of wealth, no claims of being a legitimate businessman, just the quiet, relentless, and highly efficient management of a vast, diversified criminal portfolio that now extended far beyond the streets of Chicago into the realms of international finance, sophisticated fraud schemes, and the continued stranglehold on key labor unions, all managed with the cool detachment of a Fortune 500 CEO. He understood that the RICO statute had changed the game forever, that the government was now capable of connecting the dots between the boss and the street-level crime, and so he perfected a system of insulation so effective it became the envy of organized crime families across the nation. He never gave direct orders, he only asked suggestive questions. He communicated through a trusted inner circle of buffers who themselves communicated through further layers of intermediaries. And he conducted his most sensitive business not on wiretap-prone telephones, but in the open air, during walks through public parks or in the soundproof privacy of a moving vehicle, making the collection of evidence against him a nearly impossible task for even the most determined federal agents. Under his ghostly guidance, the outfit evolved, becoming less a collection of neighborhood crews and more a holding company for a series of criminal ventures, with DiFronzo as its chairman of the board, approving major initiatives, settling disputes between underlings, and taking his substantial cut of the profits, all while maintaining his placid, suburban grandfather facade. A man more likely to be seen puttering in his garden than orchestrating a multi-million-dollar extortion plot. This period also saw the outfit's most famous and publicized crime of the era, the ruthless extortion of Hollywood producers in the casino Skim, a scheme that had originated under previous leadership but which DiFronzo oversaw with his characteristic quiet efficiency, ensuring the steady flow of cash from the Las Vegas casinos back to Chicago, an operation that was stunning in its audacity and its sheer financial success, yet which never led back to his doorstep, a testament to his meticulous operational security. His power was so absolute, yet so invisible, that law enforcement and media often speculated about who was truly in charge, sometimes attributing power to more visible, and thus more vulnerable, figures, a misdirection that suited DiFronzo perfectly, allowing him to rule from a throne of anonymity while others took the heat, a strategy that kept him out of prison and in control for longer than any of his modern predecessors. He became a myth, a whispered name in backrooms, a cautionary tale told by federal prosecutors to their junior agents, the man who was everywhere and nowhere, the criminal mastermind they could all but touch but never quite grasp, a phantom whose influence was felt in the sudden bankruptcy of a business, in the mysterious change of leadership in a union local, or in the reluctant testimony of a witness who suddenly developed amnesia, but who was never seen giving the order or holding the weapon. This was the apex of John DiFronzo's power, a time when he was, without question, one of the most successful and untouchable crime lords in American history, a man who had perfected the art of criminal leadership in the modern age, proving that in a world of satellites, wiretaps, and RICO, the most powerful king is the one whom no one can prove is king, a sovereign of silence who commanded an army of shadows and ruled an empire of whispers, all from a quiet chair in a nondescript suburban social club, his flattened nose a relic of a distant, violent past that had been wholly transcended by the vast, quiet power he now wielded without ever seeming to lift a finger. The architecture of John DiFronzo's power was a masterpiece of criminal engineering, built not on the crumbling foundation of fear alone, but on the far more stable and lucrative bedrock of systemic corruption and deeply entrenched political and economic influence that reached into the very marrow of Chicago and Illinois. His reign saw the Chicago outfit operate less like a traditional crime family and more like a parasitic, shadowy venture capital firm, its tendrils woven so intricately into the legitimate economy that disentangling them became an almost impossible task for authorities. The lifeblood of this empire remained the juice loan, a brutal form of usury where desperate businessmen, gamblers, and even other criminals were lent money at astronomical interest rates, often points that compounded weekly, creating an inescapable vortex of debt that ensured perpetual servitude and a continuous flow of cash upward into the organization's coffers. DiFronzo's innovation was to industrialize this process, moving it from the back alleys and smoky social clubs into the sterile environment of seemingly legitimate financial transactions, using fronts and shell corporations to launder the money and employing a cadre of enforcers who were experts in psychological pressure, knowing exactly how to threaten a man's family, his business, or his reputation without ever throwing a punch. A method that left no physical evidence but was often far more effective and terrifying than a simple beating. Alongside this, the outfit's control over key labor unions, particularly the Laborious International Union of North America, LINA, and the Teamsters, provided a dual stream of revenue and power. Through strategic placement of corrupt officials, they could loot pension funds worth hundreds of millions of dollars, orchestrate massive no-show job schemes, and extort construction companies through the threat of crippling strikes, all while leveraging union assets to gain control over major development projects across the city. DiFronzo, understanding the value of a clean public face, was a master at cultivating relationships with politicians, lawyers, and police officials, not always through crude bribes but through the more subtle and powerful currency of favors, campaign contributions from hidden sources, the mobilization of voter blocks, or the discreet handling of a personal or political problem that required a certain brutal efficiency outside the bounds of the law. This web of complicity ensured a degree of protection and early warning that was invaluable, creating a system where influential figures in City Hall or the police department had a vested, if hidden, interest in the continued stability and success of the outfit under DiFronzo's calm leadership. His daily routine was a study in deliberate normalcy, a powerful camouflage for his immense criminal authority. He would rise early, spend time with his family, and then make his way to one of his unassuming headquarters, often the Our Friends Social Club in Elmwood Park or a quiet corner of a suburban restaurant, where he would hold court, receiving reports, settling disputes, and issuing his subtly veiled directives to a rotating cast of captains and soldiers who treated him with a reverence normally reserved for a monarch. The flow of cash to him was constant and immense, but it was meticulously laundered through a complex network of businesses, vending machine companies, pizza parlors, construction firms, and real estate holdings, that he controlled either directly or through silent partners, a process he oversaw with a keen eye for detail, ensuring that his wealth, while vast, never attracted the wrong kind of attention through ostentatious displays. This was the golden age of his ghostly reign, a period where he demonstrated that ultimate power in the late 20th century was not about dominating the streets but about controlling the economic and political levers that moved society itself, proving that the most effective criminal is one who understands the legitimate world better than the legitimate world understands itself. He was a quiet, patient shareholder in the city's misery and prosperity, a man who profited from both despair and success, his influence a silent, corrosive force that undermined the very institutions designed to protect the public, all while he maintained the public image of a retired, elderly gentleman, a fiction so convincing that it became his most powerful weapon and his most enduring legacy, a testament to the fact that in the modern world, the most dangerous criminals wear not masks, but the bland, unremarkable face of a neighbor, a face that, in DiFronzo's case, bore the unique, flattened mark of a violent beginning that had been transformed into a symbol of ultimate, untouchable control. The immense, silent fortress of power that John DiFronzo had so meticulously constructed throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, however, could not remain entirely immune to the tectonic shifts in federal law enforcement strategy and the emergence of a new generation of prosecutors armed with the devastating weapon of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a legal tool designed explicitly to dismantle criminal enterprises by connecting the street-level crimes to the bosses who sanctioned them from the shadows. The first major crack in his impenetrable armor appeared not from a direct confrontation, but from the unraveling of his most loyal and trusted inner circle, a process that began with the relentless federal pursuit of his closest ally, Joseph the Clown Lombardo. A charismatic and cunning capo whose high-profile status and deep involvement in the outfit's core operations made him a primary target for investigators determined to find a chink in DiFronzo's defenses. This legal pressure was compounded by the meteoric rise of a series of high-stakes federal investigations with evocative code names like Operation Gambat and Operation Family Secrets. Sprawling, multi-year probes that combine traditional surveillance with the game-changing power of electronic eavesdropping, undercover operatives, and, most critically, the cultivation of turncoats within the outfit's own ranks, men who, facing life in prison, began to break the sacred oath of omerta and provide the government with an unprecedented look into the organization's secretive workings. For DiFronzo, a man who had built his entire philosophy on the principle of absolute silence and the forensic cleanliness of his operations, the advent of these cooperators was an existential threat of the highest order. These were not outsiders making accusations, but former friends, trusted associates, and made men who could directly testify to his role as the approving authority for murders, extortions, and the division of the outfit's illicit profits, putting his voice and his directives, once only whispered, now on the official record in a federal courtroom. The most significant of these cases, the landmark Family Secrets trial, which began in 2005, became a public spectacle that laid bare the brutal mechanics of the Chicago outfit for the entire world to see, detailing 18 long unsolved murders and a decades-long conspiracy of racketeering. And while John DiFronzo was notably not a defendant in this particular trial, his name echoed through the testimony as a central, spectral figure, the unseen power behind the throne, the man whom witnesses identified as the final arbiter of disputes and the ultimate recipient of tribute, forcing him out of the comforting shadows and into the harsh, unflattering light of public scrutiny as never before. This period marked the beginning of the end of his untouchable status. The federal government, unable for so long to build a direct case against him, had adopted a new strategy of death by 1,000 cuts, systematically dismantling the infrastructure that supported him, convicting his most important lieutenants, and seizing the financial assets that were the lifeblood of his power, slowly constricting the avenues through which he could operate and profit. He watched from his suburban home as the old world he had mastered crumbled around him. Lombardo was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Other key captains and soldiers were removed from the streets for decades, and the once iron grip on unions and businesses began to loosen under the watchful eye of court-appointed monitors and a more vigilant corporate landscape. The pressure was immense and unyielding, a constant, grinding force that challenged his every move and made the simple act of conducting business a monumental risk, as he could no longer trust that a conversation wasn't being recorded or that an associate wasn't wearing a wire, creating a paranoia that eroded the very foundations of trust and loyalty upon which his empire was built. This was the great paradox of his success. By being so effective and so long-lasting, he had become the primary target for a federal apparatus that would not rest until his organization was crippled, and his legend, once his greatest asset, had now become his greatest liability, painting a bullseye on his back that all subsequent investigations used as their guiding star. The ghost was being haunted, his silence broken by the voices of those he had once commanded, his invisibility compromised by the relentless gaze of the digital age, and his power, once perceived as infinite, was now being systematically and publicly dismantled piece by piece, not in a dramatic shootout, but in the sterile, procedural environment of a federal courthouse, a battlefield where his particular genius for street-level strategy and silent intimidation held no sway against the cold, hard logic of evidence and testimony. He was now an old man, his health beginning to falter, watching the legacy he had spent a lifetime building being methodically taken apart by a system he had spent a lifetime evading. A system that had finally, it seemed, adapted itself to catch a ghost, not by seeing him, but by listening to the echoes he left in the world, echoes that were now screaming his name in open court. The final years of John DiFronzo's life represented a profound and deliberate unraveling, a strategic retreat from the pinnacle of power so total and complete that it became the ultimate expression of his lifelong philosophy. Survival, above all else, was the only true victory. Faced with the relentless, mounting pressure of federal investigations, the convictions of his closest allies, and the chilling effectiveness of turncoat testimony, DiFronzo executed his last and perhaps most masterful maneuver. He began the meticulous process of dismantling his own empire and orchestrating his own disappearance from the world of active crime. This was not a surrender, but a calculated liquidation of his criminal portfolio, a quiet cashing out of his chips before the house could collapse entirely upon him. He gradually, and with immense caution, extracted himself from the day-to-day operations of the outfit, severing ties with the very crews and captains he had once commanded, distancing himself from the lucrative juice loans and union shakedowns that had funded his wealth, and withdrawing into the impenetrable fortress of his private life, a world of family, quiet routine, and carefully maintained legitimacy. He understood that the modern world, with its digital trails, its sophisticated surveillance, and its army of cooperators, had made the role of a traditional crime boss obsolete, a liability not just to oneself but to the entire organization, and in a move that showcased his unparalleled strategic foresight, he chose to become the first boss in the history of the Chicago outfit to voluntarily retire, to will himself into a state of irrelevance as a protective measure. This withdrawal was so effective that it fueled rampant speculation within law enforcement and the media. Some believed he had been quietly demoted or sidelined by a new, more aggressive faction, while others theorized he was a government informant, a notion that was almost certainly false but spoke to the utter bafflement his actions caused in a world where power was never willingly relinquished. The truth was far simpler and far more brilliant. DiFronzo had looked into the future and seen only prison or death, and he chose a third path, the path of the ghost fading back into the mist, leaving behind a legacy of silence and a power vacuum that no one figure could ever hope to fill again. His health, long rumored to be failing, became his final shield. Pleading age and infirmity, he effectively became a non-person to the federal authorities. A man so detached from the criminal activity they could document that building a new RICO case against him became a practical impossibility. He was occasionally seen, a frail old man with a distinctive flattened nose, being driven to medical appointments or sitting quietly in a restaurant, a figure from a bygone era who now seemed more a relic than a threat, his terrifying power dissipated into the mundane reality of mortality and decay. This was his final, and most complete, victory over the system that had hunted him for 50 years. He denied them the spectacle of a trial, the satisfaction of a conviction, the definitive end of a prison sentence. He would live out his days on his own terms, in his own home, surrounded by the family he had so fiercely protected. His immense wealth, though diminished by seized assets and the dissolution of his rackets, still ensuring a comfortable life far from the gritty streets where his legend was born. The empire he left behind was a hollowed-out shell of its former self, fragmented, leaderless, and desperately trying to survive in a landscape that he had correctly judged to be inhospitable to the kind of vast, centralized criminal corporation he had once led. John No-Nose DiFronzo died on October 28, 2018, at the age of 89, not in a prison cell or a hail of bullets, but in his bed, of natural causes, a quiet, unremarkable end that was, in its own way, the most remarkable and defiant act of his entire criminal career. His death certificate listed congestive heart failure as the cause, a simple, medical end for a man of immense complexity. And with his passing, an entire chapter of American organized crime was irrevocably closed. He had outlived his rivals, his enemies, his mentors, and his protégés, and he had outsmarted the justice system until the very end, proving that in the underworld, the ultimate prize is not wealth or fame, but the ability to die an old man in your own bed, leaving behind a mystery that can never be fully solved, a legend built not on what he did, but on what he chose not to do, and a silence that, even in death, speaks volumes about the nature of true, undetected power. The legacy of John No-Nose DiFronzo is a complex and contradictory tapestry woven with threads of immense power, profound silence, and ultimate, deliberate obscurity, a legacy that continues to be debated by historians, federal agents, and organized crime aficionados alike, long after his quiet death. To measure his success solely by the traditional metrics of organized crime, territory controlled, bodies buried, or years spent behind bars, is to fundamentally misunderstand the man and the revolutionary blueprint he created for criminal leadership in the modern era. His true legacy lies not in what he built, but in what he left behind, a fragmented, weakened Chicago outfit that could no longer operate with the same centralized, corporate efficiency he had masterminded, proving that his personal genius was the glue that held the sprawling empire together, and without his calm, strategic mind at the helm, the organization devolved into disconnected, less potent factions. He demonstrated, with chilling effectiveness, that in an age of overwhelming technological surveillance and relentless federal prosecution, the most potent weapon a crime lord could possess was not a willingness to commit violence, but a preternatural talent for patience, anonymity, and financial sophistication, skills that allowed him to operate on a scale comparable to his infamous predecessor, Al Capone, while avoiding both Capone's flamboyant notoriety and his ultimate fate of incarceration. The very nickname No-Nose, which once evoked a brutal, street-level past, was transformed under his stewardship into a symbol of something far more intimidating. A man who could not be scented or tracked by the hounds of justice, a phantom whose trail always went cold, a leader whose most commanding presence was his absence. This philosophy of the ghost has become his enduring lesson to the criminal underworld, a case study in how to wield power without casting a shadow, a lesson that modern criminal enterprises, from cybercrime syndicates to international drug cartels, have studied and adapted for their own purposes, understanding that visibility is the precursor to vulnerability. For law enforcement, DiFronzo remains the one who got away, the ultimate white whale whose evasion was not a failure of investigation but a testament to a criminal intellect of a rare order. A man who thought 10 steps ahead of every indictment and whose operational security protocols are still taught in FBI training seminars as the gold standard for criminal tradecraft. Yet, for all his success in evading the grasp of the law, his legacy is also one of Pyrrhic victory. In order to survive, he was forced to preside over the managed decline of the very empire he had helped build, choosing to let it wither on the vine rather than risk a dramatic, defiant stand that would have certainly ended with him dying in prison. A decision that reveals his core, driving principle was not the glory of the outfit, but the sanctity of his own freedom and the safety of his family. The neighborhood that forged him, the Little Italy of his youth, has long since vanished, gentrified, and transformed, its old secrets buried under condominiums and coffee shops, leaving his story as a relic of a grittier, more dangerous Chicago that now feels almost mythical, a whispered echo from a past that becomes more distant with each passing year. And so, John DiFronzo endures as an enigma, a paradox of power and impotence, a king who abandoned his throne to save his own skin, a brutal street thug who evolved into a corporate criminal mastermind, a man whose face was his most recognizable feature yet whose true identity remains shrouded in mystery. His story is the ultimate cautionary tale about the limits of power and the inevitable encroachment of time and progress, but it is also a chillingly effective guidebook on how to navigate the treacherous waters of high-level crime and emerge, not with glory, but with the simple, profound victory of a life lived on one's own terms, a quiet end in a noisy world, a final, perfect silence from the man who made silence his most powerful weapon. The echoes of John DiFronzo's reign and the shadow of the Chicago outfit he once commanded continue to reverberate through the city's collective consciousness and its physical landscape, a lingering phantom limb of the corrupt, muscular power that once shaped its political, economic, and social life in ways both obvious and imperceptibly subtle. To walk through the streets of downtown Chicago today is to traverse a city forever marked by the outfit's hidden hand. The soaring skyline, a testament to legitimate commerce and architectural ambition, was also built in part with concrete poured by mob-influenced unions, financed by loans from mob-connected institutions, and erected on land deals brokered through mob-intimidated negotiations, a legacy of dirty money laundered clean through the sheer, towering presence of steel and glass. The very structure of the city's power dynamics, the unspoken alliances between certain political families, construction magnates, and labor leaders, still bear the faint but unmistakable genetic imprint of the system DiFronzo helped perfect. A system where business was often conducted through a nod, a whisper, and an unspoken understanding that had been honed over decades of clandestine collaboration. While the organized, corporate-style crime syndicate of DiFronzo's era has largely fragmented, its DNA has mutated and spread, its methods adopted by a new generation of criminal entrepreneurs who operate not in social clubs but in the digital realm, applying his principles of insulation, financial focus, and anonymity to cybercrime, international fraud, and sophisticated money laundering operations that span the globe with a click. The outfit's traditional rackets, the street-level juice loans, the direct control of union halls, the systematic skimming of casinos, have diminished, not out of a sudden moral awakening, but because the world changed, and the DiFronzo model proved that lower profile, less violent, and more financially complex crimes offered a better return on investment with a fraction of the risk, a lesson the criminal world learned well. For the citizens of Chicago, the outfit's decline has not meant the end of crime, but rather its decentralization. The violent, chaotic street gangs that now plague certain neighborhoods are not a new phenomenon, but they are the chaotic, entrepreneurial successors to a vanished monopoly, operating in the power vacuum left by a centralized criminal corporation that no longer exists to impose its own brutal, but strangely orderly, form of control. The federal tools forged in the fire of the fight against men like DiFronzo, the RICO statute, the Witness Protection Program, sophisticated electronic surveillance, are now permanent fixtures of the American justice system, a lasting tribute to the threat he represented, weapons that were sharpened against his stone-like silence and are now deployed against a vast array of criminal targets, from corrupt politicians and corporate fraudsters to international terrorist networks. And for the few aging survivors of that bygone era, men now in their 80s and 90s, the name No Nose is still spoken with a mixture of fear, respect, and a tinge of nostalgia for a time when the rules were clear, the chains of command were absolute, and the city, for all its corruption, operated under a known, if terrifying, set of principles. The story of John DiFronzo, therefore, is not a closed book but a foundational text, a dark, foundational myth of a modern American city, a story that explains not just the crimes of the past, but the very structure of power in the present, a reminder that the transition from the industrial age to the information age did not eliminate criminal enterprise, but merely forced it to evolve, to become more like him, quieter, smarter, more virtual, and more focused than ever on the bottom line, leaving the violence as a last resort and the public spectacle as a fool's game. His ghost does not haunt the cemeteries of Chicago but its boardrooms, its construction sites, and its digital networks, a pervasive spirit of clandestine profit and immoral efficiency that continues to whisper that the greatest power is that which is exercised without anyone ever knowing your name, a lesson he taught the world through a lifetime of deliberate and masterful silence. The city moved on, as cities always do, building a new identity on top of the old secrets, but the foundations remain, and in the quiet moments, in the unexplained business deal, in the sudden rise and fall of a fortune, the ghost of the man with no nose still lingers, a permanent part of the city's soul, his legacy not a monument, but an absence, a void where a vast empire once stood, a silent testament to the power of the unseen. The methodology of John DiFronzo's criminal intellect represents a fascinating and dark evolution in the philosophy of power, a departure from the primal, territorial instincts of the early gangsters into a realm of almost abstract, corporate strategy where violence was not a first resort but a calculated, often deferred, instrument of policy. A tool to be used with the same dispassionate precision as a corporate raider executing a hostile takeover. His brain operated not like a street thug's but like that of a master chess player who had memorized every possible move on the board decades in advance, who understood that the true objective was not to capture every piece in a flurry of aggression, but to patiently maneuver his opponent into a position of such inescapable checkmate that the final move was often a mere formality, an acknowledgement of a defeat that had been sealed long before. This required a deep, almost innate understanding of human psychology. He knew that a man's greatest weaknesses were rarely his physical vulnerabilities but his attachments, his family, his business, his reputation, his secret shames, and DiFronzo's greatest skill was in identifying these pressure points and applying a slow, inexorable force against them, a psychological torture that could break a man's will more completely and reliably than any physical beating ever could. He viewed the entire city as a complex ecosystem of greed, fear, and ambition, and he positioned himself not as a predator roaring at the top of the food chain, but as a silent, symbiotic parasite who fed on the system's natural excesses, profiting from the desperation of the gambler, the corruption of the politician, the greed of the businessman, and the apathy of the ordinary citizen, all without ever disrupting the superficial peace that allowed the city to function. His use of language was a key component of this strategy. He mastered a dialect of deliberate ambiguity, a vocabulary of suggestion and implication where direct orders were never given, but desired outcomes were clearly understood, a linguistic dance that allowed him to orchestrate murders and multi-million-dollar schemes while maintaining a firewall of plausible deniability that proved impervious to federal wiretaps for years. He thought in terms of assets and liabilities, not friends and enemies. A loyal soldier was an asset until his recklessness made him a liability. A corrupt union official was an asset until his greed attracted federal attention. And even a trusted ally like Joseph Lombardo, while immensely valuable, was ultimately an asset that could be, and was, written off when the legal pressure became too great to shield him. This cold, dispassionate calculus extended to his own person. He understood that his own notoriety, his no-nose persona, was both an asset for intimidation and a liability for identification, and so he managed it, allowing the legend to grow in the underworld while systematically erasing the man from the legitimate world, a process of deliberate self-effacement that was the ultimate act of corporate branding. His mind was a constantly updated database of obligations and debts, a mental ledger where every favor granted was a future favor owed, and this network of IOUs, this shadow economy of influence, was more valuable to him than any single bank account, as it gave him leverage in places where raw cash would be useless. He possessed an almost supernatural patience, a willingness to wait for years, even decades, for a plan to come to fruition or for a rival to make a fatal mistake, a temporal perspective that is alien to most criminals, who are driven by immediate gratification, but which allowed DiFronzo to see the long arc of history and position himself accordingly, always on the winning side of power transitions, always adapting, always evolving. This cognitive architecture, combining strategic foresight, psychological manipulation, financial acumen, linguistic precision, and immense patience, created a criminal operative who was perfectly suited for his time, a predator who had evolved to be invisible to the censors of the justice system, a ghost in the machine who learned to hack not the software, but the very operating system of the city itself, leaving behind a legacy that is not a list of crimes, but a chilling blueprint for how to achieve and maintain power in the modern world by understanding and exploiting the space between what is legal and what is possible. A space he navigated with the quiet confidence of a man who knew he was the smartest person in every room, even if he never said a word. The psychological portrait of John DiFronzo is one of profound and fascinating contradictions. A man whose internal landscape was as complex and carefully guarded as the criminal empire he commanded. A mind built on a foundation of deep-seated paranoia that he transformed from a debilitating weakness into his greatest strategic strength. Unlike the flamboyant and narcissistic gangsters who craved admiration and fear, DiFronzo seemed to derive his satisfaction from a place of pure, cold intellect, from the silent, solitary knowledge that he had outthought every opponent and every system designed to contain him, a private victory that required no audience and no applause. This inward focus suggests a personality that was fundamentally introverted and deeply controlled, a man for whom emotional displays were not just unprofessional but dangerous, a potential leak in the airtight vessel of his composure that could sink his entire operation. His legendary silence was not merely a tactical choice but likely a core aspect of his character. He was a listener, an observer, a man who absorbed information and assessed motivations while others talked, giving him a constant strategic advantage in every negotiation and confrontation. The single, defining physical feature of his ruined nose, a mark that would have psychologically broken a more vain or image-conscious man, was instead incorporated into his identity with a stoic acceptance that bordered on indifference, suggesting a remarkable lack of ego and a practical focus on utility over appearance, viewing his own face not as a source of shame but as a tool for intimidation and a permanent reminder of the consequences of failure. His ability to maintain a seemingly normal, even mundane, family life separate from his brutal profession points to a capacity for compartmentalization that is almost unparalleled in the annals of crime. A mental partitioning that allowed him to be a devoted husband and father in one moment and a man authorizing a murder in the next, without any apparent moral friction or emotional bleed between. A skill that speaks to a chillingly pragmatic and immoral worldview where actions were judged not by their morality but by their necessity and their outcome. This lack of overt psychopathy, this absence of the sadistic joy that often accompanies absolute power, made him even more terrifying. His violence was not emotional but transactional, a necessary cost of doing business, which made it more predictable for his allies and more terrifying for his enemies, as it was utterly devoid of passion and therefore impossible to appeal to or reason with. His loyalty, often cited by those who knew him, was not born of sentimental affection but of a cold-eyed recognition that the stability of the organization, and therefore his own safety and prosperity, depended on a rigid adherence to a code of conduct, and he rewarded reliability and efficiency because they were assets, not because he felt any personal warmth. The driving force behind his half-century-long criminal career seems to have been not a lust for wealth or fame, but a deep, intellectual fascination with the game itself, the ultimate chess match against the forces of law and order, a complex puzzle of risk and reward that he found endlessly engaging. And his greatest pleasure was likely not in spending his millions, but in the daily exercise of his intellect in navigating the intricate maze he had chosen for his life. This made his final act, the quiet, deliberate retirement, the most psychologically revealing act of all. It was the move of a grandmaster who recognizes that the board has become too dangerous and the only way to win the final game is to calmly stand up and walk away, leaving his opponent staring at the pieces, forever wondering what his next move would have been. In the end, the mind of John DiFronzo remains the ultimate enigma, a black box of criminal genius that, even in death, refuses to give up its secrets, a fortress of silence that protected not just a man, but a universe of calculated decisions, cold-blooded strategies, and a unique, terrifying form of intelligence that redefined what it meant to be a successful criminal in America, proving that the most powerful weapon in the underworld is not a gun, but a mind that can see the world not as it is, but as a system of vulnerabilities to be exploited, a mind that remains, like the man himself, a ghost in the machine of history. The intricate and often misunderstood relationship between John DiFronzo and the formidable institution of the American federal government evolved over decades into a kind of dark, symbiotic waltz, a long-term strategic engagement where each party served as the other's primary antagonist and perverse justification for existence, a complex dance that defined both the hunter and the hunted in equal measure. For the FBI and the Department of Justice, DiFronzo represented the ultimate white whale, a criminal archetype so elusive and so successful that he became a career-defining obsession for generations of agents and prosecutors. A phantom whose continued freedom was a constant, galling challenge to their authority and a living testament to the limitations of their methods in the face of a truly disciplined criminal intellect. The very investigative tools that eventually crippled other crime families were, for the longest time, rendered nearly useless against him. Traditional surveillance was thwarted by his mastery of counter-surveillance techniques, his refusal to use phones for sensitive discussions, and his network of secure locations. Financial investigations ran aground on the complex web of shell corporations and seemingly legitimate fronts he used to launder his wealth, and the cultivation of informants was hampered by the profound, genuine fear he instilled and the deep-seated code of omerta that he embodied more completely than any of his contemporaries. His existence forced the government to innovate, to develop new legal and technological strategies, ultimately contributing to the refinement and aggressive application of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a statute that would become the Justice Department's most powerful weapon, not just against the mob, but against all forms of organized criminal enterprise, meaning that DiFronzo's legacy is ironically woven into the very fabric of modern federal law enforcement. For DiFronzo, the federal government was not an enemy to be defeated in a dramatic showdown, but a pervasive force of nature to be managed, a permanent operational hazard like bad weather, a systemic risk that had to be factored into every single decision, every business transaction, and every conversation, a reality that shaped his entire philosophy and dictated his every move, forcing him into a life of extreme caution and perpetual vigilance that would have broken a lesser individual. The pressure was immense and unrelenting, a psychological siege designed to wear him down, to force a mistake, yet he endured it with a stoic resilience that baffled his pursuers, absorbing their every move and adapting his strategies accordingly, turning the immense resources of the United States government into a whetstone upon which he sharpened his own criminal methodologies to a razor's edge. This decades-long stalemate was not a static affair but a dynamic, escalating arms race, with the government developing more sophisticated listening devices and surveillance technologies, and DiFronzo responding with ever more elaborate communication protocols and layers of insulation, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse where the mouse was constantly redesigning the maze. The eventual, slow-motion downfall of his organization, brought about by the cumulative effect of the RICO statute and the testimony of turncoats, was not a single, decisive victory for the government but a war of attrition that they ultimately won by systematically dismantling the world he had built, convicting his soldiers, seizing his assets, and making his business model untenable, a strategy that acknowledged they could not catch the king directly, so they would instead destroy his kingdom around him. In his final years, the relationship shifted once more. The intense, active pursuit gradually faded into a state of watchful waiting, as the government recognized that the aged, ailing DiFronzo posed a diminished threat and that building a new case against a retired ghost was a futile expenditure of resources, allowing him a quiet, unmolested exit that, in its own way, was a final, subtle form of victory. The relationship, in the end, was one of mutual creation. The government's pursuit forged DiFronzo into the perfect, untouchable criminal, and his flawless evasion, in turn, forged a more sophisticated and determined law enforcement apparatus, a legacy of intertwined destinies that outlived the man himself, leaving behind a justice system permanently altered by the long, silent war it waged against the boss who refused to be caught. A war that proved that the most formidable criminal is not the one who fights the system, but the one who learns to become invisible to it. The financial empire meticulously constructed by John DiFronzo stood as a testament to his core belief that silent, compounding profit was infinitely more valuable than loud, territorial dominance, a vast and intricate network of illicit revenue streams that flowed like hidden underground rivers beneath the seemingly dry riverbed of legitimate Chicago commerce, converging into a deep, dark reservoir of wealth that powered the entire outfit machinery while leaving almost no visible trace on the surface. His genius was in understanding that money, not fear, was the ultimate source of lasting power, and he applied a ruthless business acumen to criminal ventures that transformed them from crude shakedowns into sophisticated, profit-maximizing enterprises with their own internal logic and relentless efficiency. The cornerstone of this empire was the juice loan operation, which he refined from a simple loan sharking scheme into a form of psychological and financial slavery. He would target businessmen, gamblers, and even other criminals who found themselves in desperate, inescapable situations, offering them a lifeline at interest rates so exorbitant, often 10 to 20% per week, that the principal became a mythical, unattainable sum, and the borrower was forever chained to the weekly VIG, the interest payment, becoming a perpetual source of income for the outfit, a human ATM machine whose very life and livelihood were the collateral. Alongside this, his deep and corrupting infiltration of labor unions, particularly the laborious International Union of North America and the Teamsters, provided a dual stream of massive revenue and immense political leverage. Through strategically placed corrupt officials, he orchestrated the systematic looting of multi-million-dollar pension funds, engineered vast no-show job schemes that put outfit members on union payrolls for work they never performed, and extorted countless construction companies through the threat of crippling, costly strikes that could bankrupt a project, all while using union muscle and influence to steer lucrative contracts to outfit-controlled companies. The third pillar of his wealth was the silent, steady skim from the casinos of Las Vegas, a complex operation that involved casino employees secretly siphoning off a portion of the gambling profits before they were ever counted, funneling this untraceable cash into waiting briefcases that were then carried back to Chicago, where DiFronzo and the other bosses would divide the spoils. A scheme so brazen and so successful it formed the basis of the iconic film Casino and represented the pinnacle of the outfit's national reach. But DiFronzo's true financial innovation was in the laundering and reinvestment of this torrent of dirty money. He funneled cash through a labyrinthine network of seemingly legitimate front businesses, vending machine companies, pizza parlors, construction firms, trucking companies, and real estate holdings, using a team of complicit accountants and lawyers to create a paper trail that transformed cash earned from misery and extortion into clean, bankable assets, which he then reinvested into both legal and illegal ventures, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of wealth generation. He viewed his criminal portfolio with the cold eye of a venture capitalist, constantly assessing risk and return, divesting from operations that attracted too much heat and doubling down on those that offered high yields with low visibility, a strategy that allowed his personal fortune to grow exponentially while his legal exposure remained minimal. This financial system was so robust, so well insulated, that even as the outfit's power waned in the 2000s and key figures were imprisoned, the wealth DiFronzo had accumulated remained largely protected, secured in real estate, hidden assets, and complex trusts that withstood the federal government's best efforts to seize it, ensuring that even in his final years, he remained an immensely wealthy man, his financial security a final, unbreachable fortress that the law could never conquer. The sheer scale of the capital he controlled gave him a form of power that was almost political in nature. He could influence markets, determine the fate of large development projects, and prop up or destroy businesses with the simple allocation or withdrawal of his hidden financial support, making him a silent partner in the economic life of the city, a ghost in the machine of capitalism. His empire proved that the most successful criminal enterprise in the modern age is not a gang, but a ruthlessly efficient, diversified, and vertically integrated financial institution that deals in fear and desperation as its primary commodities, a dark mirror of Wall Street that operated by the same cold, profit-driven principles, but with enforcement mechanisms far more immediate and terrifying than any court order. The legacy of this financial empire is that it permanently blurred the line between the criminal and legitimate economies in Chicago, leaving behind a city where the origins of certain fortunes remain forever murky, and where the lessons he taught about turning violence into revenue and fear into equity continue to be studied and emulated in the shadows of the global underworld. The intricate web of personal and professional alliances that John DiFronzo meticulously spun throughout his life formed the resilient, often invisible architecture that supported his entire criminal enterprise, a network built not on fleeting friendships or sentimental loyalty, but on the cold, hard currency of mutual self-interest, proven competence, and the terrifyingly efficient enforcement of consequences for disloyalty. At the core of this web was his own family, his brothers Peter and Joseph, who were not just siblings but foundational pillars of his early criminal endeavors, trusted lieutenants whose shared blood created a bond that he believed, for a time, was unbreakable, a belief that would later be tested by the immense pressures of federal scrutiny and the differing paths their lives would take. Beyond his blood relatives, his most significant alliance was with the formidable Felix Milwaukee Phil Alderisio, a relationship that served as his violent postgraduate education in the ways of the outfit, a brutal apprenticeship that schooled him in the art of intimidation, murder, and the cold-blooded management of the outfit's most profitable and dangerous enterprises, a partnership that imbued the young DiFronzo with a reputation for ruthlessness that would precede him for decades. Simultaneously, he forged a crucial, long-lasting bond with Joseph the Clown Lombardo, a charismatic and cunning street-level boss whose flamboyant style and public profile provided a perfect counterbalance and distraction to DiFronzo's own ghost-like existence. A strategic partnership where Lombardo often played the public face of their shared power, drawing the heat of law enforcement while DiFronzo operated from the safety of the shadows. A symbiotic relationship that allowed both men to prosper for years. Another key figure in his inner circle was the fiercely loyal enforcer Butch Blozzy, a man whose unwavering dedication and operational reliability made him DiFronzo's most trusted bodyguard and confidant, a human shield and a secure conduit for messages. A man so trusted that he was one of the very few individuals granted direct, unfiltered access to the reclusive boss. These alliances were not static. They were dynamic, shifting with the tides of power and federal pressure, and DiFronzo proved to be a masterful navigator of these changing loyalties, understanding when to draw an ally closer for mutual protection and when to strategically distance himself from a liability, as he eventually did with the increasingly targeted Lombardo. A cold but necessary act of organizational self-preservation. His network extended far beyond his fellow mobsters, reaching into the seemingly legitimate worlds of politics, law, and law enforcement, where he cultivated a roster of corrupt contacts. Politicians who could fix a zoning problem or steer a contract, lawyers who could navigate the court system with suspicious effectiveness, and police officers who could provide early warnings of investigations or make evidence inconveniently disappear. Relationships built on a foundation of favors and cash that created a protective shield around his operations. This vast, interconnected web functioned like a neural network, with DiFronzo as the central processing unit, receiving information from all points, calculating risks and rewards, and sending out directives through his trusted nodes, a system that allowed him to control a vast empire without ever having to raise his voice or issue a direct, prosecutable order. The strength of this network was tested to its absolute limits during the federal onslaught of the family secrets era, when the old bonds of omerta began to fray and the calculus of self-preservation led some of his former allies to become government witnesses, a betrayal that represented not just a legal threat, but a profound personal failure of the system he had spent a lifetime building. In his final years, this web inevitably contracted, shrinking down to a small, trusted circle of family and a few aging associates, the complex architecture of his power simplifying into the basic human need for companionship and trust, a quiet conclusion to a life defined by strategic alliances. The story of these relationships is the true story of his power, a narrative that demonstrates that in the underworld, as in the legitimate world, success is never a solitary achievement but is always the product of a carefully constructed and meticulously maintained network of human connections. A web that John DiFronzo wove with the skill of a master spider, creating a structure that was both incredibly strong and, ultimately, as fragile as the silence upon which it was built. The physical and psychological toll of a life lived in the crosshairs of both rival gangsters and the full might of the federal government is a story written not in court transcripts or newspaper headlines, but in the silent, accumulating weight of perpetual vigilance, a burden that John DiFronzo carried for over 6 decades with a stoic resilience that became as much a part of his legend as his criminal successes. Imagine the constant, low-grade hum of paranoia that must have been the soundtrack to his every waking moment, the subconscious calculations performed every time he entered a room, the automatic scanning of rearview mirrors during every car ride, the inherent distrust of new faces and the careful parsing of every word spoken by even his oldest associates. A life where a single misplaced phrase or a moment of unguarded conversation could lead to a lifetime in a concrete cell, a reality that would erode the sanity of most individuals but which he normalized into a professional discipline. This existence demanded a radical separation of the self. The man known as John DiFronzo, the family patriarch who tended to his garden and enjoyed quiet dinners at home, had to be walled off completely from the entity known as No-Nos, the corporate director of crime who authorized murders and orchestrated the financial ruin of countless lives, a psychological partitioning that required a formidable and perhaps chilling level of emotional disconnection, allowing him to operate in a world of extreme violence and moral compromise without exhibiting the outward signs of trauma or conflict that would have made him vulnerable. The very nature of his power ensured a profound isolation. As the boss, he could never truly be a friend, only a superior. His position a gulf that prevented genuine camaraderie and ensured that every interaction, no matter how casual, was layered with unspoken calculations of power, obligation, and fear, condemning him to a loneliness that was the ultimate price of his throne. The relentless pressure from federal agencies was a form of slow, psychological warfare, a siege designed not to capture him immediately but to exhaust him, to isolate him, to turn his allies against him, and to wait for the inevitable mistake born of fatigue or frustration. A pressure cooker environment that he endured for years on end, a testament to a nervous system of almost superhuman fortitude. We see the physical manifestation of this toll in the decline of his health in his later years. the gradual failing of a body that had for so long been a vessel for such immense and concentrated stress, the heart problems that eventually claimed his life a possible testament to the cardiovascular cost of a lifetime spent constantly ready for a fight that never quite came, a body finally succumbing to the invisible wounds of a long war. This internal landscape of guarded solitude stands in stark contrast to the external image of the quiet, calm boss. The unflappable exterior was a carefully maintained facade, a dam holding back a river of necessary paranoia, hypervigilance, and the existential fatigue of being the one man ultimately responsible for the survival of a vast criminal corporation in its decline. He could never truly retire, not in his mind. Even in his final years, sitting in his modest home in River Grove, the habits of a lifetime would have been ingrained too deeply. The caution, the suspicion, the constant mental inventory of threats and obligations. The ghost of no-no's a permanent tenant in the mind of the elderly John DiFronzo. This relentless mental and emotional taxation is the hidden cost of a life of crime at its highest level, a cost far exceeding any prison sentence, a life sentence of internal exile served within the confines of one's own mind, a gilded cage of one's own making where the bars are made of silence and the lock is forged from the fear of betrayal. To understand the full measure of the man is to acknowledge not just his power and his wealth, but this immense, invisible burden he shouldered every single day, a burden that makes his ability to function, to strategize, and to survive for so long not just a criminal achievement, but a dark marvel of human endurance, a chilling example of what the human mind can withstand when it is relentlessly honed for a single purpose: survival at any cost, in a world where every shadow could hold an enemy, and every friend could be a government microphone. The mythologizing of John No-Nose DiFronzo began long before his death, a process that transformed the man from a flesh-and-blood criminal into a near-supernatural archetype, a symbol whose meaning shifted depending on the observer, creating a legacy that is as much folklore as it is historical fact, a narrative woven from equal parts truth, fear, and the human need to create legends out of the most enigmatic figures. Within the insular, secretive world of the Chicago underworld, he became the patron saint of the silent survivor, a living lesson in the power of patience over passion. His name invoked not with the boisterous nostalgia reserved for a Capone, but with a hushed, almost reverential tone. A cautionary tale and an aspirational model for the next generation of criminals who understood that the era of the loud gangster was over and the age of the ghost had begun. To the federal agents who hunted him, he was the ultimate puzzle, a criminal unicorn who defied all their textbooks and profiling, a man who left a trail of consequences but no fingerprints, a source of both immense professional frustration and a strange, grudging respect for an opponent who played the game at a level they had never before encountered. A figure who would be discussed in retirement gatherings and FBI academies for decades as the one who redefined the very meaning of elusiveness. For the city of Chicago at large, he was a spectral presence, a name occasionally whispered in connection with some unexplained event or the sudden downfall of a business, a convenient villain for every conspiracy theory, a shadowy explanation for the corrupt undercurrents that everyone sensed but few could ever prove, becoming a part of the city's dark mythology. A character in the same story as the Great Fire and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The media, perpetually fascinated by his nickname and his refusal to conform to the gangster stereotype, contributed to this myth-making, painting him as the last of the old-time gangsters or the invisible boss. Labels that simplified his complex reality into an easily digestible narrative, further obscuring the man behind the legend and cementing his image as a figure from a bygone era, even as he was actively shaping the present. His physical disfigurement, the source of his infamous nickname, became the central, powerful image of his myth, a ready-made symbol that allowed people to project their own fears and stories onto his ruined face, seeing in it a lifetime of violence, a refusal to conform to normalcy, a permanent mark of the underworld that he could never wash away, making him a walking, talking memento mori for the life of crime. In death, this process of mythologizing accelerated. His quiet, non-violent end allowed for a romanticized reinterpretation of his life, a narrative of the wise old Don who outsmarted everyone and died free, a story that glossed over the brutal realities of his juice loans and the corpses that paved his way to power, transforming him from a ruthless criminal into a folk hero of sorts, a symbol of individual cunning triumphing over a vast, impersonal system. The very lack of concrete information about him, the gaps in his biography, the conversations that were never recorded, and the orders that were never given, created a vacuum that was inevitably filled with speculation, exaggeration, and legend, ensuring that the historical John DiFronzo would forever be obscured by the towering figure of No-Nose, the ghost boss. This myth serves a purpose. For the city, he is a convenient repository for its collective guilt and fascination with its own corrupt history. a way to acknowledge the dark side of the American dream without having to confront its messy, violent details. For the world of organized crime, his myth is a blueprint, a sacred text on how to achieve power in the modern age, a legend that will inspire and instruct long after the specific details of his crimes have been forgotten by everyone except historians and federal archivists. And so, John DiFronzo achieved a form of immortality, not through his wealth or his power, but through his transformation into an idea, a permanent part of the American cultural landscape, a ghost story we tell ourselves about the nature of power, the price of silence, and the elusive figure who mastered both, proving that the most enduring legacy is not written in stone, but whispered in the shadows, a myth that grows stronger with each telling, long after the man himself has turned to dust. The comparative analysis of John DiFronzo's leadership style against the pantheon of American crime bosses reveals not merely a difference in tactics, but a fundamental evolutionary leap in the very conception of what it means to wield illicit power, a paradigm shift from the tribal chieftain to the corporate CEO, a transition that he alone navigated with complete and utter success. Where Al Capone ruled through a very public, theatrical brutality designed to terrorize the entire city into submission, using his larger-than-life persona and the very public spectacle of the St. Valentine's Day massacre as his primary tools of control, DiFronzo operated on the opposite principle, understanding that public terror created public outrage, which in turn created an unstoppable political will for a law enforcement crackdown. And so he chose instead to become a rumor, a whisper, a man whose power was felt precisely because it was never seen, making him far more difficult for the authorities to combat. In contrast to his own outfit predecessor, Sam Giancana, whose flashy lifestyle, high-profile connections to the Rat Pack, and political intrigues with the CIA made him a constant front-page fixture and a vulnerable target, DiFronzo was a creature of profound modesty and public anonymity, living a life so deliberately ordinary it became his most sophisticated disguise, proving that the spotlight was the most dangerous place for a modern crime lord. Compared to the East Coast counterparts like John Gotti, the Teflon Don whose flamboyant strutting, expensive suits, and open defiance of the law made him a media star and a folk hero for a time, DiFronzo was the invisible Don, whose Teflon was not a product of legal luck but of a meticulous, self-imposed isolation from the very mechanisms of fame and notoriety that ultimately sealed Gotti's fate, understanding that the camera's gaze was the precursor to the prison cell. Even measured against his contemporary, the sophisticated and media-savvy Vito Genovese, DiFronzo displayed a superior understanding of financial systems and long-term strategic positioning. While Genovese was preoccupied with the traditional, mafia-centric power struggles of New York, DiFronzo was building a diversified, financially driven empire that was less dependent on traditional rackets and more integrated into the legitimate economy, making it more resilient and far less visible. His leadership was characterized by a quality almost entirely absent in the biographies of other famous mob bosses: patience. He was not a man of impulsive action or reactive violence. He was a strategist who thought in terms of decades, not days, willing to allow schemes to mature slowly and to let rivals hang themselves with their own recklessness, a temporal perspective that allowed him to avoid the rash mistakes that doomed so many of his peers. Furthermore, his relationship with violence was uniquely dispassionate and corporate. While for many bosses, violence was an expression of personal rage or a tool for building a fearsome reputation, for DiFronzo it was purely a business utility, a form of risk management to be deployed only when the financial or strategic calculus demanded it, never as an emotional outlet, making his organization colder, more efficient, and far less prone to the internal dramas and blood feuds that crippled other families. This financial focus is his most distinguishing feature. Where other bosses measured their power in streets controlled or soldiers commanded, DiFronzo measured his in profit margins, asset portfolios, and the silent, compounding interest of his juice loans, recognizing that in the late 20th century, economic power was more potent, more scalable, and far less risky than territorial power. In the final analysis, while other bosses became cautionary tales about the dangers of hubris and the inevitable downfall of the powerful, John DiFronzo crafted a different narrative altogether. The story of the boss who won by refusing to play the game by the old rules, who redefined success not as a dramatic, fiery reign, but as a long, quiet, and immensely profitable administration that ended not in handcuffs or a hail of bullets, but in a quiet suburban home with his freedom and his fortune largely intact, a legacy that marks him not as the last of the old-style gangsters, but as the first and most complete example of the new. The undeniable and deeply troubling reality of John DiFronzo's half-century of criminal dominance is the vast and incalculable human cost that served as the dark, unspoken foundation for his wealth and power, a sprawling tapestry of ruined lives, broken families, and silenced voices that forms the true, tragic legacy of his ghostly reign. A legacy often overshadowed by the clinical fascination with his methods, but which must be acknowledged as the central, horrifying truth of his story. Each week, in countless offices, bars, and backrooms across Chicago, the relentless machinery of his juice loan operation extracted its pound of flesh from desperate men, businessmen who had stumbled into debt and found themselves trapped in a financial vortex from which there was no escape, forced to watch their life's work evaporate as they handed over envelope after envelope of cash, their dignity stripped away, their families living under a cloud of constant anxiety, their every waking moment consumed by the terror of the next collection and the hopelessness of their situation. A psychological torture that drove some to bankruptcy, others to despair, and a tragic few to take their own lives as the only way out of the inescapable maze of compound interest and implicit threats. Beyond the debtors, there were the victims of the brutal enforcement that underpinned his authority, the individuals who were maimed, tortured, or murdered on his indirect orders, their lives brutally truncated for the crime of disobedience, for being a potential witness, or simply for being in the wrong place at a time when the outfit needed to send a message. Their stories ending not in courtrooms where justice could be sought, but in the trunks of cars, in remote forest preserves, or at the bottom of rivers, their families left with a void of unanswered questions and a lifetime of grief, their deaths serving as mere transactional entries in the ledger of maintaining control. The corruption he orchestrated and profited from had a corrosive effect on the entire social fabric of the city, eroding public trust in institutions as the police, the unions, and the political class were revealed to be compromised, creating a system where the rule of law was a negotiable concept and where ordinary citizens lost faith in the very structures designed to protect them, fostering a cynicism and a resignation that became part of the city's character, a silent acknowledgement that the city did not truly belong to them, but to shadowy forces like DiFronzo who manipulated it from behind a curtain of silence and fear. The workers in the unions he controlled saw their hard-earned pension funds systematically looted, their financial security gambled away to fuel the lavish lifestyles of mobsters, their futures jeopardized so that men like DiFronzo could consolidate their power, a theft not just of money, but of peace of mind and the promise of a stable retirement after a lifetime of labor. The businesses extorted through his control of labor and construction were forced to inflate their costs, a hidden tax on the entire economy that was ultimately passed on to the consumer, making the city a more expensive place to live and work, while also stifling genuine competition and innovation, as those who played by the rules found themselves at a disadvantage against those who were willing to pay for mob protection. This human cost extends to his own family, who lived with the constant, low-grade fear that their husband and father, for all his quiet domesticity, existed in a world of sudden, extreme violence, a world that could intrude upon their carefully constructed normalcy at any moment, a psychological burden that is the invisible inheritance of a life of crime. And finally, there is the cost to the very soul of the man himself, the slow, steady erosion of his own humanity that must have occurred as he made decisions that condemned men to misery and death, as he perfected the art of emotional disconnection, and as he built walls around his heart to survive in a world devoid of mercy. A process that may have secured his freedom and wealth, but which undoubtedly came at the price of his own capacity for genuine human connection and peace. To focus solely on the strategic brilliance of John DiFronzo is to sanitize his story, to turn a real-life monster of quiet calculation into a romantic anti-hero. The true measure of his life is found not in the money he accumulated or the years he evaded prison, but in the sum total of the suffering he caused, the lives he shattered, and the trust he betrayed. A dark balance sheet where the profits of one man were paid for with the misery of thousands, a haunting reminder that behind every myth of criminal genius lies a trail of real human pain, a trail that, in the case of the ghostly man with no nose, remains largely uncharted and forever unatoned. The final decade of John DiFronzo's life was a masterclass in strategic dissolution, a carefully choreographed retreat from the world he had dominated for so long, a process not of defeat but of deliberate and calculated disengagement designed to achieve his ultimate goal, to die a free man, surrounded by the trappings of the legitimate life he had so skillfully used as a camouflage. As the new millennium dawned, he watched from a distance as the legal noose tightened with a ferocity he had long anticipated. The landmark Family Secrets trial of 2007 served as a gruesome public autopsy of the outfit he had once commanded, a spectacle that laid bare the murderous mechanics of the organization and resulted in life sentences for his old allies, effectively decapitating what remained of the traditional leadership and validating his decision to withdraw. He understood that the world of wiretaps, cooperators, and RICO statutes had made his once brilliant methods of insulation merely sufficient for survival, not for active command, and so he initiated the meticulous liquidation of his criminal portfolio, severing ties with the crews and captains who had been his hands and feet in the street, quietly closing down the most vulnerable of his illicit revenue streams, and allowing his once formidable influence over unions and businesses to gently lapse, not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, untraceable whispers. His public life narrowed to an even finer point of obscurity. The occasional sighting was now of a frail, elderly man, his iconic flattened nose the only remaining clue to his fearsome past, being helped in and out of a car for a doctor's appointment or sitting silently in a corner of a local restaurant, a ghost slowly fading into the light. The immense fortune he had accumulated, though diminished by the collapse of his rackets and the seizure of some assets, was now securely hidden within a complex web of legitimate-seeming holdings and trusts, its origins laundered by time and layers of corporate obfuscation, ensuring that his family would want for nothing and that his own final years would be comfortable, a final victory over the government's efforts to strip him of his wealth. His health became his final and most effective shield. Pleading the very real infirmities of old age, he transformed in the eyes of the law from a public enemy to a medical case, a man too frail and sick to pose a current threat, making the massive expenditure of resources required to build a new case against a retired, dying man a futile and unpalatable prospect for federal prosecutors. This was not a surrender but the execution of his long-term exit strategy, the final move in a chess game he had been playing for 60 years, a move that sacrificed the board to save the king, acknowledging that the empire was lost but that the architect could still escape the burning city. His death in 2018, from congestive heart failure at the age of 89, was the logical and fitting conclusion to this final phase. It was an ordinary, medical end for a man who had become, in his later years, extraordinarily ordinary, a quiet closing of a book filled with violence and intrigue, its final pages blank and calm. There was no dramatic deathbed confession, no last-minute revelation of hidden treasures or secret sins, just the silent, final exhalation of a man who had mastered the art of keeping secrets and took the full measure of them to his grave. In these final years, he achieved a perverse form of the American dream he had initially sought through crime. A comfortable home, a loving family, and a peaceful death, all funded by a lifetime of brutality and exploitation, a stark contradiction that lies at the heart of his story. The ghost had not been captured, not been conquered, but had simply chosen to stop haunting, to dissipate into the ether, leaving behind a legacy of silence, a mountain of unanswered questions, and a chilling demonstration that in the modern world, the greatest criminal success is not to rule, but to successfully disappear. The enigma of what John DiFronzo truly knew and what secrets he carried to his grave forms an impenetrable black hole at the center of his story, a void of unknown dimensions that continues to exert a powerful gravitational pull on historians, journalists, and federal agents, forever tantalizing them with the possibility of ultimate truths that are now permanently lost to history. He was a living repository of the outfit's most darkly guarded secrets, a walking archive of unresolved mysteries that stretched back to the middle of the 20th century. He knew the precise circumstances and the ultimate fate of countless individuals who had been made to disappear by the organization's ruthless hand, men like Tony the Ant Spilotro, whose brutal murder in an Indiana basement remains one of the mob's most infamous killings, and he held the definitive answers to the fates of other missing souls whose families never received closure, their cases growing cold in police file cabinets while the truth resided silently within him. His knowledge extended to the outfit's most sensitive and far-reaching political conspiracies, the full, unvarnished truth behind its corrupt alliances with mayors, governors, and perhaps even figures on the national stage. The specifics of deals struck in smoke-filled rooms that altered the political landscape of Chicago and Illinois for decades, the details of which he took with him, sparing a host of powerful, now aging figures from the scandal and imprisonment that would have surely followed such revelations. He possessed the complete, unedited financial blueprint of the outfit's empire, the locations of hidden stashes of cash and assets that may never be found, the identities of the silent partners and front men who helped launder billions of dollars over the years, and the intricate details of international banking schemes that moved money beyond the reach of American law, a vast, hidden fortune that may still be waiting in plain sight, its origins forever obscured by his silence. Most chillingly, he knew the full roster of the outfit's hidden allies within law enforcement and the judiciary, the names of the corrupted cops who looked the other way, the agents who leaked information, and the judges whose favor could be purchased, a list that would have shattered public trust in the justice system and which he guarded not out of loyalty, but as a final, unassailable insurance policy. The sheer weight of this knowledge, the burden of holding the truth behind hundreds of crimes and conspiracies, must have been an immense psychological load, yet he carried it with his characteristic stoicism, understanding that his power and his safety were contingent upon his ability to be a perfect, permanent vault, a man whose silence was more valuable than any testimony he could ever give. This lifelong commitment to omerta was his final and most profound act of control. Even in death, he dictates the narrative, forcing the world to forever speculate, to piece together fragments and clues, but never to know the complete picture, forever denying the justice system the satisfaction of full disclosure and the families of victims the cold comfort of definitive answers. The unanswered questions are his lasting legacy. How many murders did he actually authorize? What was the full extent of the outfit's reach into the highest levels of government? Where is the money hidden? These questions will now never be answered, and in that, he achieved a final, posthumous victory, maintaining his sovereignty over the truth until his last breath and beyond, ensuring that the ghost would remain a ghost, that the legend would remain unfettered by the inconvenient specifics of fact, and that the name John No-Nose DiFronzo would forever be synonymous not with what is known, but with what can never be known. A permanent and haunting question mark in the annals of American crime. The cultural and cinematic legacy of John DiFronzo, or rather the profound lack thereof, is in itself a powerful testament to the unique and ghostly nature of his criminal career, standing in stark contrast to the sprawling filmographies and popular mythologies that have grown around his more flamboyant counterparts in the underworld. While the names of Al Capone, John Gotti, and even his own outfit predecessor Sam Giancana have been immortalized in countless movies, television series, and books, often portrayed by A-list actors who imbue them with a tragic, Shakespearean grandeur, the story of No-Nose DiFronzo has remained curiously absent from the mainstream cultural consciousness, a void that perfectly mirrors the man's own strategy of invisibility and his deliberate eschewal of the very notoriety that fuels the engine of popular culture. There is no iconic photograph of him sneering in a flashy suit, no bombastic courtroom speeches, no tape recordings of his voice boasting of his power. His only widely circulated image is a mugshot from his youth, a grainy, black-and-white glimpse of a grim-faced man with a distinctive facial disfigurement, an image that hints at a story but provides none of the dramatic, cinematic hooks that filmmakers and audiences crave. The very qualities that made him such a successful criminal, his silence, his patience, his financial focus, and his bureaucratic leadership style, are antithetical to the requirements of dramatic storytelling, which thrives on conflict, dialogue, and visible power struggles, elements that were entirely absent from his methodical, behind-the-curtain reign. Hollywood simply wouldn't know what to do with John DiFronzo, a film about a man who spends his days in quiet meetings, managing financial portfolios and issuing ambiguous, non-prosecutable statements, all while maintaining a placid suburban home life, lacks the explosive, visceral punch of a Scarface or the operatic family drama of The Godfather. His story is one of absence and implication, a narrative defined by the crimes that cannot be proven and the orders that were never directly given, a storyline that is intellectually fascinating but visually and dramatically inert, resisting the easy translation into a 2-hour biopic. This cultural omission is his final and most complete triumph over the myth-making machine. He has denied the public the satisfying, simplified story arc, the rise and fall narrative that allows society to consume crime as entertainment and then comfortably file it away. Instead, his legacy resides in the more niche realms of true crime documentaries and meticulously researched books, where the nuances of his strategies can be explored. But even there, he remains a frustratingly elusive subject, a silhouette rather than a fully realized character. The one major cinematic connection, the film Casino, which dramatized the outfit skimming of Las Vegas casinos, features characters and events from his era. But DiFronzo himself is a spectral presence off-screen, one of the unnamed bosses back in Chicago who count the money and remain untouched by the violent drama unfolding in Nevada, a fittingly anonymous portrayal for a man who specialized in anonymity. In the end, the fact that there is no famous actor associated with the role of John DiFronzo, no memorable line of dialogue attributed to him, and no definitive film about his life, is the ultimate proof of his success. He achieved the impossible for a man of his power. He became a non-person in the cultural record, a secret that the world knows exists but can never truly see, ensuring that his true story remains exactly where he wanted it. In the shadows, understood only by a few, and forever. Immune to the distorting lens of popular fame. His is a story written in invisible ink, visible only when held to the right light by those willing to look beyond the glamour and the gunfire, a subtle, complex, and chilling narrative that continues to unfold not on the silver screen, but in the quiet, ongoing analysis of what it means to wield power without ever being seen to hold it. The geographical landscape of Chicago and its surrounding suburbs serves as a silent, unwitting monument to the reign of John DiFronzo, a city whose very streets, buildings, and social institutions are imprinted with the fading but indelible fingerprints of his ghostly empire. A physical testament to a power that was designed to be invisible but whose consequences were woven into the urban fabric. To traverse the near West Side, where he was born and raised, is to walk through the genesis of his story, a neighborhood now largely transformed by gentrification but whose old bones still remember the crowded, immigrant-filled streets where a young boy learned the brutal calculus of survival and where the social clubs that once served as his early classrooms have been replaced by condos and artisanal coffee shops, the old world buried but not entirely erased. The suburb of Elmwood Park, with its unassuming single-family homes and quiet, tree-lined streets, stands as the heartland of his operational power, the location of the Our Friends social club and other nondescript storefronts that served as the nerve centers of his command, places where the fate of men and the flow of millions of dollars were decided in hushed tones, their mundane exteriors belying the immense criminal authority that once resided within, now just empty spaces or legitimate businesses, the echoes of those conversations long since dissipated into the air. The soaring skyscrapers of the Chicago Loop, symbols of global commerce and architectural ambition, are also, in a very real sense, monuments to his influence. Many were built with concrete poured by mob-influenced unions, financed through institutions with shadowy connections, and erected on land deals brokered with the implicit threat of outfit interference, their gleaming facades a permanent part of the city's skyline, standing as the most visible and enduring legacy of the dirty money he helped launder into a semblance of legitimacy. The casinos of Las Vegas, though hundreds of miles away, were for decades a remote financial colony for his organization, a river of untaxed, unreported cash that flowed steadily back to Chicago to fill the coffers he helped manage, making the glittering strip an unlikely and unwilling tributary to the wealth of a man who likely never set foot in most of them, a symbol of his national reach. The quiet, modest home in River Grove where he spent his final years is perhaps the most poignant landmark, a physical representation of his core philosophy. Immense power concealed within a shell of utter normalcy, a fortress of privacy that protected him more effectively than any army of bodyguards ever could, a place where the most feared crime boss in the Midwest lived the life of a retired, unassuming grandfather, a perfect and chilling camouflage. The federal courthouses where his underlings were tried and convicted are also part of this geography, buildings where the justice system waged its long, slow war of attrition against his empire, where the testimonies of broken omerta echoed in wood-paneled courtrooms, and where the legal framework that ultimately constrained his power was meticulously assembled, piece by piece. And finally, the cemeteries where he and so many of his contemporaries are buried form a silent, scattered necropolis of this bygone era, the gravesites unassuming, the inscriptions simple, the secrets of their lives interred with them, leaving the city above to move on, to build and reinvent itself upon the foundations they laid, both legitimate and corrupt. This geographical legacy is a palimpsest. The new city is written over the old, but the faint outlines of the previous text remain, visible to those who know how to look, a permanent reminder that the history of a place is not just found in its official monuments and museums, but in the quiet, unmarked corners where power was truly exercised, in the social clubs that looked like nothing, in the suburban homes that hid everything, and in the towering buildings that were funded by a river of hidden crime, a landscape forever haunted by the ghost of the man with no nose, who understood that to control a city, you need not conquer its landmarks, but simply become an inseparable part of its unseen architecture. The philosophical underpinnings of John DiFronzo's criminal worldview present a chillingly coherent, if utterly immoral, framework for understanding power, a personal doctrine forged in the violent streets of his youth and refined over a lifetime of clandestine warfare against the institutions of society. A belief system that elevated survival and profit above all other considerations, including loyalty, honor, and even the traditional mafia codes he was sworn to uphold. At its core was a radical and unshakable belief in the supremacy of the self, a profound individualism that viewed the entire world, from the lowliest street hustler to the most powerful government agency, as a system of assets and liabilities to be managed for personal benefit and organizational stability, a perspective that allowed him to make decisions with a dispassionate, almost algorithmic coldness that separated him from the more emotionally driven gangsters of the past. His entire life was a testament to the principle that true power is not the ability to command obedience through fear, but the capacity to operate with complete impunity by becoming so deeply integrated into the legal and economic fabric of society that one becomes indistinguishable from it. A ghost in the machine whose manipulations are felt as natural market forces or unexplained political shifts, never as the deliberate actions of a single man. This philosophy rejected the romanticized notions of the honorable gangster or the loyal family man. For DiFronzo, Honor was a vulnerability and loyalty was a currency that was valid only as long as it served a practical purpose. A mindset that enabled him to distance himself from lifelong associates like Joseph Lombardo when they became legal liabilities, not out of personal betrayal, but as a necessary act of corporate triage to preserve the larger enterprise. He operated on a different temporal plane than his peers, embracing a concept of time where patience was not a virtue but a strategic weapon, where victories were measured not in days or months, but in decades, and where the ultimate goal was not a dramatic, short-lived reign, but a long, quiet, and profitable administration that ended in freedom and comfort, a goal that required the subordination of ego and the rejection of the short-term victories that doomed so many of his rivals. His relationship with violence was equally philosophical. He did not enjoy it nor did he shirk from it, but viewed it as a specialized tool in a large toolkit, a form of communication to be used with precision and only when all other, quieter forms of persuasion, financial pressure, psychological manipulation, the leveraging of secrets, had been exhausted or were deemed insufficient for the task at hand, making his violence, when it occurred, all the more terrifying for its utter lack of passion, and its pure, functional finality. He believed in the power of silence not just as a tactical necessity but as a state of being, a way to move through the world without leaving ripples, to observe without being seen, to listen without having to speak, understanding that in a world saturated with noise and information, the silent man holds all the advantages, possessing a clarity and a focus that his louder, more desperate opponents could never achieve. This worldview extended to his understanding of the law, which he saw not as a moral code but as a complex system of rules and vulnerabilities to be analyzed, navigated, and exploited, a game whose every move could be anticipated and countered by a mind sharp enough to see 10 steps ahead, a belief that allowed him to face the full might of the federal government not with defiance, but with a quiet, intellectual confidence that he could outthink any indictment they could devise. In the end, the philosophy of John DiFronzo was a dark reflection of the American dream itself, a belief in self-reliance, strategic innovation, and the relentless pursuit of prosperity, but twisted into a shape that rejected all moral and legal constraints, creating a blueprint for a life of perfect, efficient criminality that stands as a terrifyingly effective, if monstrous, achievement, a testament to the idea that the most dangerous man is not the one who breaks the rules, but the one who masters them so completely that he renders them irrelevant, operating in a space beyond good and evil, in the vast, silent territory of pure, unaccountable power. The ultimate, unanswerable question that hangs over the entire narrative of John No-Nose DiFronzo is not what he did, or how he did it, but whether his life, in its final calculation, can be considered a success, a query that forces us to confront our own definitions of victory, legacy, and the true cost of a life lived in deliberate opposition to the laws and morals of society. By the most stark and pragmatic metric of his own chosen profession, the avoidance of prison and a violent death, he was arguably the most successful American crime boss of the modern era, a man who navigated the treacherous waters of organized crime for over 6 decades and died an old man in his own bed, of natural causes, his freedom intact, a feat that eluded every one of his famous contemporaries, from Capone to Gotti, from Giancana to Lombardo. If the goal was the accumulation of vast, untouchable wealth, then he succeeded spectacularly, amassing a fortune that withstood the efforts of the entire federal apparatus to seize it, ensuring financial security for his family for generations and proving his mastery over the dark arts of financial manipulation and money laundering. If the objective was raw, untouchable power, then for a significant portion of his life he achieved it, becoming the de facto ruler of a criminal corporation that influenced the economy, politics, and daily life of one of America's greatest cities, all while remaining a ghost in the system, his name unknown to the vast majority of the people whose lives he affected. Yet, if success is measured by the durability of one's legacy, by the creation of something that endures and thrives beyond one's own lifespan, then his reign was a catastrophic failure, for the empire he commanded is now a hollowed-out, fragmented shadow of its former self, its power broken, its leadership decimated by prosecutions, its traditional rackets rendered obsolete by time and technology, leaving behind no lasting structure, only a memory of fear and a library of cold cases. If success is measured by honor, respect, and loyalty, then his story is one of profound emptiness, for he died isolated, surrounded by a silence of his own making, having outlived or distanced himself from the men he once called brothers, his name a byword for cold calculation rather than respected leadership, a king who sacrificed his court to save his throne and then abandoned the throne itself. If the measure is peace of mind, a clear conscience, or the simple human comforts of trust and genuine connection, then his life was a barren landscape, a psychological prison of his own construction where paranoia was a constant companion and every relationship was ultimately a transaction. A life devoid of the very things that give existence meaning beyond the mere accumulation of power. The sheer human suffering he caused, the lives ruined by his juice loans, the families shattered by his violence, the public trust eroded by his corruption, forms a moral debt so immense that no amount of strategic brilliance or personal longevity can ever hope to balance the scales, painting his success in the darkest possible hues and forcing us to question whether any victory purchased with such a currency can ever truly be considered a win. In the end, the story of John DiFronzo is a Rorschach test for our own values. To the aspiring criminal, he is a patron saint, a proof of concept that the system can be beaten through intellect and patience. To the moralist, he is a monster, a cautionary tale about the soul-destroying nature of absolute power. To the historian, he is a fascinating transition point, the man who bridged the era of the street gangster and the corporate criminal. His life forces us to ask, is it better to reign for a day as a lion, known and feared by all, or to survive for a lifetime as a ghost? Your power real but unacknowledged, your victories silent, and your legacy a complex puzzle of contradictions? John DiFronzo chose the path of the ghost, and by doing so, he achieved a form of success that is as chilling as it is complete, a victory that is simultaneously undeniable and utterly empty. A testament to the fact that the most complex and ambiguous legacies are often left not by those who shout their triumphs from the rooftops, but by those who, like the man with no nose, choose to move through the world in perfect, impenetrable, and forever debated silence. And so, the final, lingering echo of John No-Nose DiFronzo is not the memory of a specific crime or dramatic courtroom confrontation, but the pervasive, unsettling silence he left in his wake, a void that speaks more powerfully than any confession or boast ever could, a silence that remains his most definitive and enduring characteristic, a permanent part of the historical record. His story concludes not with a definitive period marking the end of a sentence, but with an ellipsis, a trailing off that invites perpetual speculation and ensures that the full truth of his life and reign will forever remain just beyond our grasp, a puzzle with missing pieces that can never be recovered. He demonstrated with terrifying clarity that in the modern world, the ultimate power does not lie in the control of territory or the number of soldiers commanded, but in the mastery of information, the strategic allocation of violence, and, above all, the disciplined cultivation of anonymity, a blueprint for criminal success that has outlived him and will undoubtedly be studied and emulated by those who seek power in the shadows for generations to come. His legacy is a paradox, a king who is most remembered for his absence, a billionaire who lived like a man of modest means, a monster who presented himself as a benign grandfather, a force of nature that left behind no clear path of destruction, only the unsettling sense that the world had been subtly, irrevocably altered by his passage. The city of Chicago, the primary stage for his long, silent drama, moved on, as great cities always do, its skyline changing, its politics evolving, its neighborhoods transforming, yet the ghost of his influence lingers in the unexplained fortune, the suddenly abandoned business, the cold case file, and the whispered stories passed down through families who remember when the outfit's word was law. He achieved the peculiar American immortality of becoming a legend, but a legend of a uniquely elusive kind, one defined by questions rather than answers, by secrets rather than revelations, by silence rather than sound. The hunt for him is over, the pursuit has ceased, but the mystery remains, vibrant and unsolvable, a permanent fixture in the annals of true crime and a chilling reminder of the limits of justice and the formidable power of a human will dedicated entirely to the art of evasion. In the final analysis, the most shocking truth about John DiFronzo is not the crimes he committed, but the profound and simple fact that he got away with it, that he played the most dangerous game imaginable against the most powerful opponents for the highest stakes, and he won, by his own ruthless definition of winning, dying free, wealthy, and unrepentant, having outsmarted, outlasted, and outsilenced everyone who ever stood against him. His life stands as a dark monument to the power of the human will when it is stripped of conscience and focused with laser-like intensity on a single goal: to exist on one's own terms, outside the boundaries of law and morality, to become a law unto oneself, a sovereign of the shadows, a ghost in the machine of society. The story of the man with no nose is, therefore, ultimately complete, yet forever unfinished, a narrative that satisfies our curiosity only enough to make us realize how much we will never know, a tale that ends exactly as it began, with a quiet man, a ruined face, and a silence that echoes through the decades, a silence that is, and always will be, the true legacy of John DiFronzo. The story of the ghost of Chicago may be over, but the stories of countless other shadowy figures who shaped history from the darkness are waiting to be uncovered. The world of organized crime is vast, complex, and filled with characters whose lives are just as compelling and enigmatic as John DiFronzo's. We have only just scratched the surface. If you found this deep, documentary-style narrative captivating, you're not going to want to miss our next exploration into the hidden corners of power, crime, and consequence. Help us continue to bring these meticulously researched, long-form stories to life. Your engagement fuels this channel. Please, show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and clicking that notification bell so you are the first to know when our next documentary drops. The journey into the underworld continues, and your participation makes it possible. We want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell us which other mysterious crime figures you would like us to profile next. Who deserves the deep dive treatment? Your input directly shapes our future content. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones told in a whisper. The geographical landscape of Chicago and its surrounding suburbs serves as a silent, unwitting monument to the reign of John DiFronzo, a city whose very streets, buildings, and social institutions are imprinted with the fading but indelible fingerprints of his ghostly empire. A physical testament to a power that was designed to be invisible but whose consequences were woven into the urban fabric. To traverse the near West Side, where he was born and raised, is to walk through the genesis of his story, a neighborhood now largely transformed by gentrification but whose old bones still remember the crowded, immigrant-filled streets where a young boy learned the brutal calculus of survival and where the social clubs that once served as his early classrooms have been replaced by condos and artisanal coffee shops, the old world buried but not entirely erased. The suburb of Elmwood Park, with its unassuming single-family homes and quiet, tree-lined streets, stands as the heartland of his operational power, the location of the Our Friends social club and other nondescript storefronts that served as the nerve centers of his command, places where the fate of men and the flow of millions of dollars were decided in hushed tones, their mundane exteriors belying the immense criminal authority that once resided within, now just empty spaces or legitimate businesses, the echoes of those conversations long since dissipated into the air. The soaring skyscrapers of the Chicago Loop, symbols of global commerce and architectural ambition, are also, in a very real sense, monuments to his influence. Many were built with concrete poured by mob-influenced unions, financed through institutions with shadowy connections, and erected on land deals brokered with the implicit threat of outfit interference, their gleaming facades a permanent part of the city's skyline, standing as the most visible and enduring legacy of the dirty money he helped launder into a semblance of legitimacy. The casinos of Las Vegas, though hundreds of miles away, were for decades a remote financial colony for his organization, a river of untaxed, unreported cash that flowed steadily back to Chicago to fill the coffers he helped manage, making the glittering strip an unlikely and unwilling tributary to the wealth of a man who likely never set foot in most of them, a symbol of his national reach. The quiet, modest home in River Grove where he spent his final years is perhaps the most poignant landmark, a physical representation of his core philosophy. Immense power concealed within a shell of utter normalcy, a fortress of privacy that protected him more effectively than any army of bodyguards ever could, a place where the most feared crime boss in the Midwest lived the life of a retired, unassuming grandfather, a perfect and chilling camouflage. The federal courthouses where his underlings were tried and convicted are also part of this geography, buildings where the justice system waged its long, slow war of attrition against his empire, where the testimonies of broken omerta echoed in wood-paneled courtrooms, and where the legal framework that ultimately constrained his power was meticulously assembled, piece by piece. And finally, the cemeteries where he and so many of his contemporaries are buried form a silent, scattered necropolis of this bygone era, the gravesites unassuming, the inscriptions simple, the secrets of their lives interred with them, leaving the city above to move on, to build and reinvent itself upon the foundations they laid, both legitimate and corrupt. This geographical legacy is a palimpsest. The new city is written over the old, but the faint outlines of the previous text remain, visible to those who know how to look, a permanent reminder that the history of a place is not just found in its official monuments and museums, but in the quiet, unmarked corners where power was truly exercised, in the social clubs that looked like nothing, in the suburban homes that hid everything, and in the towering buildings that were funded by a river of hidden crime, a landscape forever haunted by the ghost of the man with no nose, who understood that to control a city, you need not conquer its landmarks, but simply become an inseparable part of its unseen architecture. The philosophical underpinnings of John DiFronzo's criminal worldview present a chillingly coherent, if utterly immoral, framework for understanding power, a personal doctrine forged in the violent streets of his youth and refined over a lifetime of clandestine warfare against the institutions of society. A belief system that elevated survival and profit above all other considerations, including loyalty, honor, and even the traditional mafia codes he was sworn to uphold. At its core was a radical and unshakable belief in the supremacy of the self, a profound individualism that viewed the entire world, from the lowliest street hustler to the most powerful government agency, as a system of assets and liabilities to be managed for personal benefit and organizational stability, a perspective that allowed him to make decisions with a dispassionate, almost algorithmic coldness that separated him from the more emotionally driven gangsters of the past. His entire life was a testament to the principle that true power is not the ability to command obedience through fear, but the capacity to operate with complete impunity by becoming so deeply integrated into the legal and economic fabric of society that one becomes indistinguishable from it. A ghost in the machine whose manipulations are felt as natural market forces or unexplained political shifts, never as the deliberate actions of a single man. This philosophy rejected the romanticized notions of the honorable gangster or the loyal family man. For DiFronzo, honor was a vulnerability and loyalty was a currency that was valid only as long as it served a practical purpose, a mindset that enabled him to distance himself from lifelong associates like Joseph Lombardo when they became legal liabilities, not out of personal betrayal, but as a necessary act of corporate triage to preserve the larger enterprise. He operated on a different temporal plane than his peers, embracing a concept of time where patience was not a virtue but a strategic weapon, where victories were measured not in days or months, but in decades, and where the ultimate goal was not a dramatic, short-lived reign, but a long, quiet, and profitable administration that ended in freedom and comfort, a goal that required the subordination of ego and the rejection of the short-term victories that doomed so many of his rivals. His relationship with violence was equally philosophical. He did not enjoy it nor did he shirk from it, but viewed it as a specialized tool in a large toolkit, a form of communication to be used with precision and only when all other, quieter forms of persuasion, financial pressure, psychological manipulation, the leveraging of secrets, had been exhausted or were deemed insufficient for the task at hand, making his violence, when it occurred, all the more terrifying for its utter lack of passion, and its pure, functional finality. He believed in the power of silence not just as a tactical necessity but as a state of being, a way to move through the world without leaving ripples, to observe without being seen, to listen without having to speak, understanding that in a world saturated with noise and information, the silent man holds all the advantages, possessing a clarity and a focus that his louder, more desperate opponents could never achieve. This worldview extended to his understanding of the law, which he saw not as a moral code but as a complex system of rules and vulnerabilities to be analyzed, navigated, and exploited, a game whose every move could be anticipated and countered by a mind sharp enough to see 10 steps ahead, a belief that allowed him to face the full might of the federal government not with defiance, but with a quiet, intellectual confidence that he could outthink any indictment they could devise. In the end, the philosophy of John DiFronzo was a dark reflection of the American dream itself, a belief in self-reliance, strategic innovation, and the relentless pursuit of prosperity, but twisted into a shape that rejected all moral and legal constraints, creating a blueprint for a life of perfect, efficient criminality that stands as a terrifyingly effective, if monstrous, achievement, a testament to the idea that the most dangerous man is not the one who breaks the rules, but the one who masters them so completely that he renders them irrelevant, operating in a space beyond good and evil, in the vast, silent territory of pure, unaccountable power. The ultimate, unanswerable question that hangs over the entire narrative of John No-Nose DiFronzo is not what he did, or how he did it, but whether his life, in its final calculation, can be considered a success, a query that forces us to confront our own definitions of victory, legacy, and the true cost of a life lived in deliberate opposition to the laws and morals of society. By the most stark and pragmatic metric of his own chosen profession, the avoidance of prison and a violent death, he was arguably the most successful American crime boss of the modern era, a man who navigated the treacherous waters of organized crime for over 6 decades and died an old man in his own bed, of natural causes, his freedom intact, a feat that eluded every one of his famous contemporaries, from Capone to Gotti, from Giancana to Lombardo. If the goal was the accumulation of vast, untouchable wealth, then he succeeded spectacularly, amassing a fortune that withstood the efforts of the entire federal apparatus to seize it, ensuring financial security for his family for generations and proving his mastery over the dark arts of financial manipulation and money laundering. If the objective was raw, untouchable power, then for a significant portion of his life he achieved it. becoming the de facto ruler of a criminal corporation that influenced the economy, politics, and daily life of one of America's greatest cities, all while remaining a ghost in the system, his name unknown to the vast majority of the people whose lives he affected. Yet, if success is measured by the durability of one's legacy, by the creation of something that endures and thrives beyond one's own lifespan, then his reign was a catastrophic failure, for the empire he commanded is now a hollowed-out, fragmented shadow of its former self, its power broken, its leadership decimated by prosecutions, its traditional rackets rendered obsolete by time and technology, leaving behind no lasting structure, only a memory of fear and a library of cold cases. If success is measured by honor, respect, and loyalty, then his story is one of profound emptiness, for he died isolated, surrounded by a silence of his own making, having outlived or distanced himself from the men he once called brothers. His name a byword for cold calculation rather than respected leadership, a king who sacrificed his court to save his throne and then abandoned the throne itself. If the measure is peace of mind, a clear conscience, or the simple human comforts of trust and genuine connection, then his life was a barren landscape, a psychological prison of his own construction where paranoia was a constant companion and every relationship was ultimately a transaction, a life devoid of the very things that give existence meaning beyond the mere accumulation of power. The sheer human suffering he caused, the lives ruined by his juice loans, the families shattered by his violence, the public trust eroded by his corruption, forms a moral debt so immense that no amount of strategic brilliance or personal longevity can ever hope to balance the scales, painting his success in the darkest possible hues and forcing us to question whether any victory purchased with such a currency can ever truly be considered a win. In the end, the story of John DiFronzo is a Rorschach test for our own values. To the aspiring criminal, he is a patron saint, a proof of concept that the system can be beaten through intellect and patience. To the moralist, he is a monster, a cautionary tale about the soul-destroying nature of absolute power. To the historian, he is a fascinating transition point, the man who bridged the era of the street gangster and the corporate criminal. His life forces us to ask, is it better to reign for a day as a lion, known and feared by all, or to survive for a lifetime as a ghost? Your power real but unacknowledged, your victories silent, and your legacy a complex puzzle of contradictions? John DiFronzo chose the path of the ghost, and by doing so, he achieved a form of success that is as chilling as it is complete, a victory that is simultaneously undeniable and utterly empty, a testament to the fact that the most complex and ambiguous legacies are often left not by those who shout their triumphs from the rooftops, but by those who, like the man with no nose, choose to move through the world in perfect, impenetrable, and forever debated silence. And so, the final, lingering echo of John No-Nose DiFronzo is not the memory of a specific crime or dramatic courtroom confrontation, but the pervasive, unsettling silence he left in his wake, a void that speaks more powerfully than any confession or boast ever could, a silence that remains his most definitive and enduring characteristic, a permanent part of the historical record. His story concludes not with a definitive period marking the end of a sentence, but with an ellipsis, a trailing off that invites perpetual speculation and ensures that the full truth of his life and reign will forever remain just beyond our grasp, a puzzle with missing pieces that can never be recovered. He demonstrated with terrifying clarity that in the modern world, the ultimate power does not lie in the control of territory or the number of soldiers commanded, but in the mastery of information, the strategic allocation of violence, and, above all, the disciplined cultivation of anonymity, a blueprint for criminal success that has outlived him and will undoubtedly be studied and emulated by those who seek power in the shadows for generations to come. His legacy is a paradox, a king who is most remembered for his absence, a billionaire who lived like a man of modest means, a monster who presented himself as a benign grandfather, a force of nature that left behind no clear path of destruction, only the unsettling sense that the world had been subtly, irrevocably altered by his passage. The city of Chicago, the primary stage for his long, silent drama, moved on, as great cities always do, its skyline changing, its politics evolving, its neighborhoods transforming, yet the ghost of his influence lingers in the unexplained fortune, the suddenly abandoned business, the cold case file, and the whispered stories passed down through families who remember when the outfit's word was law. He achieved the peculiar American immortality of becoming a legend, but a legend of a uniquely elusive kind, one defined by questions rather than answers, by secrets rather than revelations, by silence rather than sound. The hunt for him is over, the pursuit has ceased, but the mystery remains, vibrant and unsolvable, a permanent fixture in the annals of true crime and a chilling reminder of the limits of justice and the formidable power of a human will dedicated entirely to the art of evasion. In the final analysis, The most shocking truth about John DiFronzo is not the crimes he committed, but the profound and simple fact that he got away with it, that he played the most dangerous game imaginable against the most powerful opponents for the highest stakes, and he won, by his own ruthless definition of winning, dying free, wealthy, and unrepentant, having outsmarted, outlasted, and outsilenced everyone who ever stood against him. His life stands as a dark monument to the power of the human will when it is stripped of conscience and focused with laser-like intensity on a single goal: to exist on one's own terms, outside the boundaries of law and morality, to become a law unto oneself, a sovereign of the shadows, a ghost in the machine of society. The story of the man with no nose is, therefore, ultimately complete, yet forever unfinished, a narrative that satisfies our curiosity only enough to make us realize how much we will never know, a tale that ends exactly as it began, with a quiet man, a ruined face, and a silence that echoes through the decades, a silence that is, and always will be, the true legacy of John DiFronzo. The story of the ghost of Chicago may be over, but the stories of countless other shadowy figures who shaped history from the darkness are waiting to be uncovered. The world of organized crime is vast, complex, and filled with characters whose lives are just as compelling and enigmatic as John DiFronzo's. We have only just scratched the surface. If you found this deep, documentary-style narrative captivating, you're not going to want to miss our next exploration into the hidden corners of power, crime, and consequence. Help us continue to bring these meticulously researched, long-form stories to life. Your engagement fuels this channel. Please, show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and clicking that notification bell so you are the first to know when our next documentary drops. The journey into the underworld continues, and your participation makes it possible. We want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell us which other mysterious crime figures you would like us to profile next. Who deserves the deep dive treatment? Your input directly shapes our future content. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones told in a whisper.